In 2019, Kawhi Leonard had one of the greatest individual title runs of all time, with the weight of Canada on his shoulders. His 30.5 points per game throughout these playoffs was the 11th highest anyone has ever averaged, and it's on par with some of Michael Jordan's less ridiculous playoff runs. He was getting compared to the alleged GOAT non-stop, and it's hard to blame people, but he was never supposed to be this good. Kawhi entered the NBA as the first pick outside of the lottery in 2011, being traded that night from the Pacers to San Antonio, where he would blossom under the greatest coach of all time, before being betrayed by him and that team, demanding a trade, and going on one of the greatest playoff runs of all time, maybe even just out of pure spite. But since 2019, his career has kind of been a nightmare. Now, in 2025, Kawhi Leonard has played just 17 games this season at the time of recording, averaging just 16.7 points. People have been talking about the guy like he's 100% done, and while that may be jumping the gun, I can't fully blame people for that either. Kawhi's career seems more known for what it isn't rather than what it is or was. And today, I fear that people have forgotten just how compelling this guy's career has been. And as you can tell by the runtime of this video, there's a lot I have to say about Kawhi, as well as the historical context of the three franchises he's played with and how their presence has shaped the NBA landscape at large. Welcome to NBA Deep Dive, Supercut Edition. Thank you to Bear Mattress for sponsoring this video. Their President's Day sale is live. Head to bearmattress.com/rustybuckets and use my code rustybuckets to get 40% off of your mattress plus 2 free pillows. Bear Mattress is a premium fiberglass-free mattress designed to upgrade your sleep, improve your overall quality of life, and it's conveniently shipped to your door for free. Bear makes it easy to find the perfect mattress for you. Their sleep quiz matches you to the ideal mattress based on your body type and sleep preferences. For example, I'm a side sleeper and prefer a softer mattress, so I matched with the Bear Elite Hybrid. It's been a game changer for me. I've had my Bear mattress for a while now, and it has dramatically improved my sleep and lifestyle. Coming from a 13-year-old mattress, the difference has been night and day. I wake up feeling refreshed, and it's genuinely hard to get out of bed because it's so comfortable. Here's a few things that make Bear stand out. The mattress keeps you cool and clean, is designed to regulate temperature, and is completely fiberglass free. Bear delivers your mattress right to your door with free shipping in the US for easy delivery and setup, which is super simple. It's a heavy box naturally, so I'd recommend having another person with you to help out. You just take it out of the box, carefully cut away the plastic, and watch it inflate. Within minutes, you have a full mattress ready to go. Now, I'm quite confident that you're going to love your Bear mattress, and Bear shares that same confidence, so they offer a free 120-night sleep trial. You get over 3 months to test it out and make sure you love it. If not, you can return it at no charge. Bear mattresses also come with a limited lifetime warranty, so you'll be loving your sleep for a long time. Bear also offers financing and flexible payment plans to make it even easier to get your Bear. I love my Bear mattress, and I think you would too. If you're looking to upgrade your sleep, head to bearmattress.com/rustybuckets and use code rustybuckets to get 40% off of your Bear mattress plus 2 free pillows during their President's Day sale. This deal is even better than what's offered on site, so check them out while you can. And a huge thank you to Bear Mattress for sponsoring this video. So first things first with Kawhi. We need to jump into his career with the Spurs, which is a little complicated because there ends up being a ton of baggage there. And I'm not talking about some Paul George, Allen Iverson-like baggage. I'm talking like betrayal, backstabbing, and cults. I made a video back in 2021 about the Spurs, Kawhi, and primarily Greg Popovich. I will say some of the shots and music quality are not up to our 2025 standard, but we tried to basically remaster it as well as we can, and the overall video illustrates all of my issues with the Spurs organization and how they essentially doomed Kawhi's career to end in the fashion that it did. Back in the 90s, the San Antonio Spurs hired a former assistant coach from the Warriors as their new head coach, not realizing they were setting in motion their franchise going from an essentially irrelevant team to one of the most acclaimed franchises in the sport for the next 20 years. Hold up, wait a minute, that's actually a typo, my bad. We have to go back to the 90s where Spurs executive Greg Popovich fired the head coach of the team and then hired himself. Like, think about how crazy that is. Pop was both an executive and a coach as a rookie head coach. That just doesn't happen. Executive and head coach historically is a bad idea, by the way. Not that that has been the case of Popovich, it's just very abnormal for a rookie head coach to have that kind of power. And as for how Greg let his team know he'd be the new coach, well, he fired the old one without telling them, and then got on the team bus as they were leaving for a road trip, and then he simply said, "I let go of Hill, I'll be your coach." And then he told the driver to head to the arena. This was after months of Greg seeming to want that position. Bob Hill himself said that Greg was clearly always wanting to be the head coach. This was a very weird start to a coaching career. Greg's first year in San Antonio as a coach was a poor one, not from his own failures, but due to an injury to the team's aging superstar David Robinson. On top of this, the way Greg asserted himself into the role was not all that well received. In fact, in the first home game with him as head coach, Spurs fans booed him in the introductions. Despite this, though, it was very clear that Greg had the respect of his players, not necessarily because he earned it, but because he commanded it. Being that he was the general manager, if you didn't like what he was saying, well, he could just trade you. He had absolutely no issue asserting his power and making sure he got his way from the very beginning. This season was essentially a state of limbo, waiting for the next thing to happen and hoping for a high draft pick that could take the team to the next level, because while the Spurs had seen success to this point with Robinson at the helm, they'd only go as far as the Western Conference Finals. It was very clear that this team had a cap on it, and with their core going into their 30s, there was very much a need for a spark. That spark would come in the form of the #1 pick in the 1997 draft, where the Spurs would select one of the greatest players in the history of the game, bringing Tim Duncan and David Robinson together, forming the Twin Towers. A nickname that, well, didn't age well. But with this young player who is a superstar in the NBA from day one, Greg's coaching prowess combined with David Robinson's talent meant the Spurs had a real championship window out of the gate. And while they wouldn't get it in 98, in 99 through the dominance of the Twin Towers, the Spurs brute forced their way through the Western Conference, beating the Kobe and Shaq Lakers that were more so the Shaq Lakers at that time, and the Rasheed Wallace, Jermaine O'Neal Blazers in the conference finals. They met the 8th-seeded Knicks in the finals. Yes, you heard me right. The 8th-seeded New York Knicks. And they swiftly took care of them as well, all in all losing just 2 games in total in the playoffs. This championship run established that Duncan, Pop, and the Spurs were here, and they weren't going anywhere. They proceeded to lose in the playoffs over the next 3 years, as no one was stopping the now Kobe and Shaq Lakers. In those 3 years, though, a few notable things happened. The team drafted Manu Ginobili and Tony Parker. Tim Duncan would win an MVP. Popovich would hire R.C. Buford as the general manager while remaining president of basketball operations, meaning that Popovich was still completely in control of every move that the team made. And the relationship between Pop and Duncan would continue to grow. A relationship that would be the foundation of the Spurs' success over the next 2 decades.
All he really cares about is being a good guy, living his life, doing the right thing. It kind of leaks over into basketball, which was his job for so long. He just wanted to do the best job he possibly could but mostly to win.
It's quite interesting to hear Popovich actually talk about how he viewed Duncan. One thing that Pop often refers to is how much Duncan wanted to, quote, do a good job. It's pretty telling of their dynamic and really of both of them that Duncan viewed basketball that way and that Popovich admired him for viewing basketball that way. You'll understand why I find that really interesting a little bit later. 2003, though, was the year for the Spurs. Actually, shit, my bad. Another typo. I don't know how these keep getting in here. 2003, though, was the year for Tim Duncan. While you might look at this roster and see the names David Robinson, Tony Parker, and Manu Ginobili, Manu was a rookie, Parker was good but still just a 15-point-per-game scorer in his second year, and David was in the last year of his career at age 37, averaging 8 and 8. Duncan, on the other hand, averaged 23 points, 13 rebounds, 4 assists, and 3 blocks, and he led the team in everything besides for steals and assists. He was also still second in assists as a power forward. He was MVP, the Spurs won 60 games and made a championship run where Duncan averaged 25, 15, 5, and 3 on 53% shooting. He pretty much single-handedly beat the Kobe and Shaq Lakers in round 2, where Duncan averaged 28, 12, and 5 while slowing down Shaq on the other end, on top of him averaging 24, 17, 5, and 5 blocks in the finals, including a 21, 20, 10, and 8 performance in Game 6 that is argued to have been a legitimate quadruple-double that he was just not given the 2 blocks for. And as for his help on this run, offensively, Steven Jackson averaged an inefficient 13, and Tony Parker averaged an inefficient 15. That was pretty much it. Duncan wasn't always the flashiest and biggest stat sheet stuffer, but he was this year for damn sure. His 2003 run is wildly underappreciated and under-talked about. It is one of the most impressive individual runs by any player in league history. 2004, they would lose to the Lakers. 2005, they would win it all, this time with the trio of Timmy, Tony, and Manu completely coming together as a dominant big three. 2006, they would lose to the 60-win Dirk-led Mavs, and 2007, they would run through the West, losing just 4 games, and they would sweep a defenseless Cavaliers team who was basically just LeBron James and a bunch of future car salesmen. But then, we get a 7-year drought between them and the next championship. As for why they went through such a large drought, not getting even as far as the finals despite their personnel not really changing, well, there's no clear answer. This video is obviously me looking at the Spurs critically, but they really did not do much wrong besides not winning a series that they weren't heavily favored in. Every loss in this 7-year stretch is justifiable to me. One thing that did become abundantly clear though was that for whatever reason the formula was not working when it had worked in the past. Duncan was getting older and the Spurs couldn't afford to keep repeating the same cycle, otherwise they'd just be wasting the rest of his career. So what was the solution? Well, the Spurs could not rely upon Duncan anymore to the extent that they had. The Spurs progressively made a huge shift in their offense, going away from just spamming Duncan post-ups and Tony Parker floaters to instead running a motion and pass-heavy offense. This spawned one of the most intricate and beautiful offenses in the history of basketball. I was new to basketball in 2013 when this team came around, but even then I knew that this was something special. In 2013, with some new personnel that fit the system, the Spurs won 58 games and were the #1 offense in the league. With this team, they made it through the West, losing just 2 games and looking like a dominant force despite not having a superstar on the team anymore, with Duncan being older. However, the celebration of their first finals appearance in 6 years did not last long, because as good as the Spurs were, they were walking into a series as an underdog, because outside of a few outliers, teams just didn't win championships without superstars, especially when they were facing a team like the Big Three Miami Heat, who had 2 superstars and an all-star. That being said, the Spurs got the upper hand in this series, winning Game 5 to go up 3-2. Game 6 comes around and the Spurs have complete control until, well...
James catches, puts up the 3. Won't go. Rebound box. Back out to Allen. His 3-pointer. Bang! Tie game with 5 seconds remaining.
Yeah, that wasn't ideal. What also wasn't ideal is that the offensive rebound that Chris Bosh got happened because Greg Popovich decided to take Duncan off of the floor in favor of Boris Diaw. Pop inserted himself into a situation he had no business in, trying to make a 1 million IQ play when it was in fact a 0 IQ play. The Heat win in overtime and then they eventually win Game 7. This loss was big for the team. This was a make or break moment for the Spurs empire. Either they got one more running it back, or this was the end. Well, it wasn't the end. 2014, the Spurs were very similar to the year prior. They once again get to the finals, once again face the Heat, but this time they win, and they do so convincingly. Winning in 5 games, with their 4 wins coming with an average deficit of 18 points. This was a team effort that was led by the team's young forward Kawhi Leonard, who played amazing defense on LeBron James and averaged 18 points on 75% true shooting. Fuck. I completely forgot to mention in the script there that the Spurs drafted Kawhi. I could have just put it back in retroactively instead of doing this cut, but actually there's no but. I should have done that. This Spurs team was a product of Greg Popovich more so than Tim Duncan and any other individual player. 99 was Duncan and Robinson, 03 was all Tim Duncan, 2005 was a collective effort but still mostly Duncan, and 07 was a total team effort with the big 3. But this year, Greg was the biggest reason for their success, with his coaching being the reason this roster was so successful. Pretty much any other coach with this roster does not go half as far as they did, and Pop deserves all the credit in the world for that. And it was this series that, for me and for many other people, cemented Greg Popovich as the greatest coach of all time. Yeah, as much slander as this video is going to have for Popovich, I still think he's the greatest coach of all time. But speaking of that slander, let's get to that. After 2014, Kawhi Leonard was established as the league's next rising star, which could not have been better timing for the Spurs as Duncan was 38 years old. Kawhi averaged 16 and 7 the following season, making clear progress in his creating ability, and in the 2016 season he fully broke out, averaging 21 points per game on very good efficiency. Also that year was the first year of LaMarcus Aldridge in San Antonio. LaMarcus Aldridge had left the Portland Trail Blazers in order to be the face of the franchise and to be more marketable, and in his first year, Kawhi Leonard became the face of the franchise, and who the fuck goes to San Antonio to be a marketable superstar? That's like going to Antarctica in the dead of winter to improve your tan, or going to Cleveland to fix your depression. Just completely illogical. But this new duo won a whopping 67 games this year, which was a franchise record, doing so in Duncan's last year as a Spur. Side note, we don't talk about how the 73-win Warriors and the 67-win Spurs happened in the same season in the same conference nearly enough. That's fucking wild. However, this team would lose to the OKC Thunder in the second round in 6 hard-fought games. Game 7 would be the last game of Duncan's career, meaning that Popovich would be without Duncan for the first time since he was a rookie head coach, which was 20 fucking years ago. This would be interesting. Duncan might not have been particularly great in his last few years, but he was always the leader on the floor and Pop's right-hand man. Some might say his bottom bitch, but I think that's a bit rude. So how did the Spurs do in their first year without Duncan? Well, they were a 60-win team again, and Kawhi was officially a superstar. The Spurs took care of business in 6 games in both of the first 2 rounds, and they would face the 3-headed snake of the Warriors in the conference finals. Game 1 was going extremely well for the Spurs. They had full control over the game thanks to the effort of Kawhi Leonard, who had 26 points in just 24 minutes. However, the reason he played just 24 minutes was, well, this.
Leonard fires from the corner. Leonard goes down again. And he's in pain again in front of the Spurs bench. Again, that's what they call all the time when you get your feet into the landing space of the shooter. Taking a pounding here in the third quarter, one that was already sore.
Now there's quite a bit of debate surrounding this injury, whether it was dirty or not. It was. And whether or not the Spurs would have won if Kawhi did not get hurt. They wouldn't have. But that's not what's important here. What's important is that this injury would end up being essentially what caused the fall of the Spurs empire. People just didn't know that at the time. This injury set on a sequence of events that would lead to a very different future from what we all expected for the Spurs, Kawhi Leonard, and Greg Popovich. But how? How could an injury that wasn't anybody's fault except for Zaza Pachulia's end up being what caused the fall of this empire? Well, it's actually not a long story. Kawhi Leonard injures his quad. He's set to return sometime in the following season. However, Kawhi and the Spurs seem to disagree on when that return should actually take place. After meeting with team doctors, Kawhi is cleared to play again, but he doesn't agree. He knows his body best and he doesn't feel he's ready, so he asks to get a second opinion from non-Spurs team doctors and stays away from the team. Kawhi played just 9 games in the 2017-18 regular season, where he could have looked worse, but he definitely didn't look his best. Kawhi, even after being cleared, refused to play. This caused a lot of stress around the organization and tensions rose as a result. Now, this is the part where Spurs fans start to blame Kawhi Leonard, but me personally, I was on his side then, and I obviously still am now. The dude knows his own body, and while the Spurs have a pretty good reputation in terms of taking care of their players' health, they also had a vested interest in him returning as the team was struggling quite a bit without him. Now, with this conflict going on internally, there was some stress and reason to be concerned. However, what came next would be a surprise to everyone. Kawhi said, "Enough is enough. Trade me." And as much as the Spurs tried to fight it and convince Kawhi to change his mind, it just didn't happen. Now, even coming off of an injury and on a 1-year deal, there was still plenty of interest around the league. There were offers on the table such as future and rising stars Brandon Ingram from the Lakers and Jaylen Brown from the Celtics, both deals involving first-round picks. The Lakers actually apparently offered a quote-unquote Godfather deal for Kawhi, which would have been perfect because Kawhi was actually specifically asking to go to the Lakers. However, Greg, who remember was still completely in control of what the front office did, decided, you know what, Kawhi, I'm gonna be petty. I'm not sending you to sunny LA. I'm sending you to cold as shit Toronto. A whole other country. Hope you brought your passport, bitch. The Spurs got back DeMar DeRozan and Jakob Poeltl. The Raptors in the following season would go on to win the 2019 championship, with Kawhi having one of the greatest playoff runs in league history. Meanwhile, the Spurs were bounced out in the first round. Then in the offseason, Kawhi left the Raptors to sunny-ass California, the thing that he had desired to begin with. So being petty did not even work out for Popovich, because Kawhi got a championship and finals MVP and then still ended up in Los Angeles in a situation where he was able to pick the pieces to build around him to his liking, and then the Spurs on the other end of things got a shit deal. So what went so wrong in San Antonio that going from one generational talent to another would result in the collapse of the empire that the franchise had built? Well, it's time to talk about Greg Popovich. Ego is defined as a person's sense of self-esteem or self-importance. The ego is the other side of the coin of id, which focuses on the more animalistic parts of the brain, while ego is where the conscious mind lives. Everybody has an ego. It's not inherently a bad thing. However, what is a bad thing is an inflated ego. Inflated ego is a very large problem among athletes and people who work in sports in general, especially at the highest level, a level that Greg Popovich has seen himself in over the last 2 decades. And if you don't believe me, here's an interview I think sums him up pretty damn well.
Okay, what do you want? I'm so tired of this.
What went wrong for you guys tonight?
What went wrong for us?
Coach, you started Danny Green basically on Kevin. Was that, I mean, did that work very well?
Did you watch the game?
Yes.
What do you think?
Didn't.
It didn't work very well. So we'll have Danny grow 4 or 5 inches by Monday night. Tell him to jump higher and move quicker. And we'll tell Kevin, don't be so good. Come on. Come on, you're getting paid. Ask something.
And please don't tell me that him smiling or laughing it off means that it was just a joke and it doesn't actually count. First of all, there's an element of truth in all jokes. That's what Popovich is actually thinking. He's just saying it out loud. But as someone who also does this move all the time because I too am an asshole, I can recognize it as you're just trying to cover for being an asshole. Hell, I honestly believe that the decision to put Diaw in over Duncan at the end of Game 6 in 2013 was his ego saying he knew better than the obvious. With the obvious being leaving one of the greatest defenders in league history on the floor in an important defensive moment. So Greg has an inflated ego. It kind of comes with the territory. It's pretty natural and, again, understandable. What's not natural and not common is how not inflated Tim Duncan's ego was. Among the greatest players in league history, which Duncan absolutely is, there's quite a handful of inflated egos among them. Duncan is different. Throughout his career, Duncan took no issue doing whatever it took to win. You'd have a tough time telling pretty much any other player of Duncan's caliber to shoot the ball less and be more involved in passing, but Timmy, no issue. You need him to take a pay cut so we can add more depth? He wouldn't have a problem with that either. And this was perfect for a guy like Greg Popovich because the problem with inflated egos, even if understandable, like if I was this fucking guy, I'd have a bit of an ego. How could you not? Is that when you take two big egos and you put them on the same team, that can create friction. That friction doesn't always have to boil over and affect the team on the floor, but it often can. Of course, the greatest example of this is Kobe and Shaq, two of the greatest players of all time and some of the biggest egos in league history. Now, these egos were managed to the point where they were still one of the most successful duos in the history of the league, but it eventually ended up boiling over. Looking at another all-time inflated ego, we have Mr. Took It Personally himself, Michael Jeffrey Jordan. Once again, another guy under Phil Jackson, something we'll talk about a bit later, don't worry about it. It's often said how lucky Michael Jordan was to have a player like Scottie Pippen who fit with him so well. But to me, at least from an on-the-court perspective, I don't think that fit was necessarily seamless and perfect. Really, I think he would have been better paired with a big man who knew how to pass. However, that's not to say that Scottie Pippen wasn't a perfect pairing for Michael Jordan, because he was. Not for his on-court ability, but for his lack of ego. He wasn't completely without one by any means, just look at his reaction after The Last Dance, or really, I guess, most of what he said in the last, month or two. But Scottie never took issue with MJ being the guy, and he wouldn't challenge him in a way that would cause insurmountable damage. Pop and Duncan actually had a somewhat similar relationship to MJ and Scottie, the difference being, of course, that Pop is a coach. Now, you'd think under those circumstances that the coach would be the Scottie, but in terms of who was the dominant personality, Greg was the MJ in this example. It was and is clear that Greg Popovich was and is the leader of the team. His word is gospel, you don't question him. You don't challenge Greg Popovich. He made sure of that from day one by asserting his power as a general manager, and Tim Duncan, being the personality that he was perfectly okay with that. Give Duncan a job and he'll do it without question and do it well, and Pop knows how to give the right player the right job. He has a reputation for getting a lot more out of players than most coaches can, and that's for good reason. Dude made Gary Neal a valuable part of a finals team, made Danny Green a damn near finals MVP. It's almost like a general commanding his infantry. Greg Popovich is an amazing general, and Tim Duncan was an amazing soldier. However, you might have noticed something about that description. That doesn't sound like an NBA head coach. It sounds like a college coach. Or, I guess, a drill sergeant, not that there's much of a difference. With college basketball, it's essentially a cult around a figure that you don't question. You as a player are a step below the authority of the coach, even if you are among the best of the best in college. Zion Williamson could not question Coach K. That shit would get shut down real fast. That's the college coaching culture. The problem with that is that Popovich is quite literally the only other coach in the league who is like that and continues to be employed. No other coach over the last 20 years has had the identity and the success and failure culture based solely off of the back of the head coach. That's not to say that personalities like this haven't existed as coaches in the NBA. They just don't last long because the league's culture doesn't align with that. It's one of the many reasons why college coaches often do so poorly in the NBA position. A head coach in recent memory who had the same mentality as Greg Popovich is Jim Boylan, who had his players essentially stage a mutiny against him within the first week of him coaching them. He obviously wasn't even a quarter of the brilliant basketball mind that Greg Popovich is, despite all the room that he had in that giant fucking head. But the point is, his mentality, the way he approached coaching, was relatively similar to Greg Popovich, and his style just didn't work in the NBA. It was incompatible with NBA culture. That type of coaching style is only sustainable in the NBA if you have the type of players who are fine falling in line in a more college player mindset. And that's pretty damn rare unless you try to cultivate that type of roster. So, this is why the Spurs often look for diamonds in the rough, players who are just looking for an opportunity or maybe are even a bit unsure of their place in the league. That's why we see the Spurs with so many foreign players, G-leaguers, and players ready to retire. Greg has been quoted as saying that foreign-born players are much harder working and much less entitled than American players, but the reason he feels this way and the reason he likes those types of players is because the less entitled ones are a lot easier to control. Bosses tend to like to scream entitlement when they aren't getting their way. Guys who will do what their general says because they don't have anywhere else to go. That's not to say it's been entirely smooth sailing. There have been divergents who didn't stick around long as a result or were just made to fall in line with a bit of strong arming. But overall, it was a pretty efficient system that would hide Pop's biggest weakness. But now enter Kawhi Leonard, the perfect successor to Tim Duncan, another quiet superstar who would fall in line with the culture cultivated by Greg Popovich. How perfect. Well, as it turns out, no. Not perfect. Kawhi Leonard isn't a very outspoken individual, nor one who showcases much emotion in really any context. One can only assume that when Kawhi Leonard got married, his vows were just the Wikipedia definition of what marriage is, followed by a monotone I do. However, we were wrong to think that that meant that he was without personality, without ambition, and especially without ego. To many, Kawhi was the perfect transitional piece to continue the Spurs' dominance. Tim retires, Kawhi fills his role, and Popovich continues to fill up the championship display case until the day he dies. But well, we wouldn't be talking right now if that's what had ended up happening. Kawhi Leonard asked to get a second opinion on his injury, which shouldn't have been a huge deal at all. Right? Well, turns out it was, because questioning the great Popovich and Spurs system, even to a minor degree, just simply won't stand. And based on his last 20 years as a coach, Greg has no reason to think that declining this would result in much of anything. At this point, it was natural for him to have an unquestioned control. In the past, the perfect soldier Tim Duncan would not get out of line and question his general, so there is no reason to believe that that would be any different for Kawhi. However, I believe, and this is just speculation based on some context clues, so bear that in mind. I believe that when Kawhi asked to get this second opinion, and it was made out to be a bigger deal than it should have been, that was the moment for him where the questioning that he had already started to do of the franchise really boiled over. And that quickly led him onto the path that he is on today. Now, I imagine that Kawhi had already begun to question the Spurs. However, it was this that really sent him on a downward spiral, and it's what followed that really put the nail in the coffin.
Do I still feel like a part of the team or the group or anything, like the group text, or we just try to make him feel like he's not just totally on the outside looking in?
Yeah, I mean, he's out there, he's with us, but you know, it's hard when you don't practice with the team. But
Okay.
the bulk of the camaraderie and is pre-game, post-game, and half-times when you're going through adversity or some trouble, and he's not with us most of the time.
I've been through it. It was a rehab for me too for 8 months, you know, so same kind of injury. Mine was 100 times worse, but same kind of injury, and I trust my Spurs doctors. They've been with me, you know, my whole career. They know my body better than anybody, and so for me it was a no-brainer to do the surgery with them. So when I did my injury, 48 hours I was in surgery. I didn't take like 2 weeks and go through options and stuff like that. For me it was a no-brainer because I feel like we have the best medical team in the world.
The two players remaining from the Duncan era who had won 4 championships in that era, when asked about their superstar teammate who is the reason their team is successful in the first place, essentially shit talk and dismiss him, not taking their teammate's side, bashing him. And it was these interviews that would really give weight to the term, when there is smoke, there is fire. At this point, Kawhi was just completely disillusioned with the Spurs franchise and the great Greg Popovich. He quickly came to the realization that this was no longer the place for him. So, that smoke became fire as he shocked the world and asked to be traded. And when I say shocked the world, make no mistake, that is not hyperbole. Kawhi asking for a trade was shocking. Yes, there was smoke, not an insignificant amount of it, but no one expected a fire quite like this. Because to this point, the Spurs and Popovich had over 20 years of an established empire that on the outside looking in appeared to be squeaky clean. If they lost, it was because the other team was better. If they failed, they would bounce back. If a player left, it was something wrong with that player, not the team. This was the model franchise that represented how to do things right at every turn. A player, and even superstar player, asking out isn't abnormal, especially in recent NBA history where it seems like there's a new superstar player on the block every other offseason. However, one asking out of San Antonio just didn't seem possible. And that's because people didn't realize just how inherently flawed the structure of the San Antonio Spurs really was. And yes, I did just say that. The Spurs structure was always inherently flawed because it was always based around a system that had to be specifically cultivated around Greg Popovich's ego, and that could not be sustained without very, very specific pieces. Greg did a great job of making sure that he had the right pieces to win and to maintain that system, but at a certain point, stuff started to slip through the cracks. That something that slipped through the cracks was Kawhi Leonard. Greg Popovich and his inflated ego does not work alongside another inflated ego. Popovich is incompatible with superstar players who have those inflated egos like him, which is most of those superstars, including Kawhi Leonard. Honestly, not just an inflated ego, really any ego or self-respect. The reason it took so long for us to realize this flaw is that Greg found himself in the perfect position for his ego and style of coaching with San Antonio and with Tim Duncan. Greg's biggest flaw is covered in its entirety by the position he had as a coach and executive, and by the big fundamental, which is why it's particularly funny and annoying to me when people try and discredit Tim Duncan's accomplishment because he was coached by Greg Popovich. Because it is abundantly clear to me after the post-Duncan era that it was Pop who needed Duncan, not the other way around. At every turn since Duncan was drafted, Pop could tell this unbelievable talent what to do, and he would comply without hesitation. No matter how hard the task or ridiculous the command, Duncan always did his job. Like I said, Duncan was a good soldier and Pop a good general. So with this relationship, they won many battles together. However, that soldier couldn't just be replaced on a whim. The successor to the perfect soldier has to be yet another perfect soldier. And much to the dismay of Greg Popovich, unfortunately for him, Kawhi wasn't the perfect soldier. He has ambitions. He wanted to be the face. He wanted to get his own damn credit for his own damn talent. He wanted to be recognized as a superstar, wanted ads and shoe deals, wanted what any superstar player does, and he wanted to be sure he was healthy before thrust out to battle again. Even that was too much. All of this wasn't compatible with Popovich's system. The general asked his soldier to fall in line like he had so many times before, like the soldier before him had time and time again, and this time he said no.
Leonard has grown so frustrated with how the Spurs handled his injury this past season, he has decided to seek his walking papers. Now, Leonard, according to Hanes sources, feels the franchise turned on him.
Kawhi was tired of the way the Spurs were treating him, but that was really only the straw that broke the camel's back, because Kawhi was already growing in ambition. Ambition that San Antonio just couldn't accommodate. Ambition to be one of the league's premier superstars, one in a big market, and one preferably back home in California. After asking out, Kawhi made it very clear where he wanted to be, and he had quite a bit of leverage to get there. Off of his injury and on a one-year contract, there was a whole lot of risk in trading for him. Add on to it him saying that he wanted to play in LA and LA only. Well, at that point, it turns trading for him into a desperation move for any other team. So now, I guess we just sit back and see who has the better package between the Lakers and Clippers and pick up the story from there. Yeah, I'm just kidding. He got extradited to Canada.
The deal is final. The Spurs will send Kawhi Leonard and Danny Green to the Raptors for DeMar DeRozan, Jakob Poeltl, and a 2019 first-round pick. League sources tell me the Raptors and Spurs are getting on a trade call with the league office momentarily to finalize the deal.
So how exactly did Toronto find themselves in this position? Let's rewind a bit.
Lowry up at the rim.
Actually, just real quick, let's go even further back.
It's the finale on the first round for Vince Carter.
It's over, ladies and gentlemen.
Okay, I can see how you thought that's what I meant, but no, I mean like really, really far back. November 1st, 1946, just over a year after the end of World War II, the NBA's very first game, the inception of one of America's most major pro sports leagues, was played in Toronto. Yeah, the NBA, originally called the BAA at the time, actually started with the Toronto Huskies. They played the New York Knicks and took a 2-point loss, 68-66. This would become all too familiar for the Huskies, as they would go on to finish their first and final season with a record of 22-38 before being dissolved. This small place in NBA history from Toronto would remain nothing more than obscure trivia for nearly a half century, until in 1995 the NBA expanded to 29 total teams, adding 2 Canadian franchises, the Vancouver Grizzlies and the Toronto Raptors.
They lived over 85 million years ago, but they're coming back to play a little hoop.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Raptors are born.
Naturally, as expansion teams, the Grizzlies and Raptors were both awful for a while, and they were not very successful franchises financially as a result. Canada didn't have quite the basketball culture of America where the game originated, and after a few seasons, it looked like the NBA expanding to Canada might have been a mistake. That was before he arrived.
Carter with his first shot. First round for Vince Carter.
It's over.
Gonna get a shot off. He does. Got it. Vince Carter wins the game. Great hands and strip. Ahead of the back. Showtime. Oh no! And misses a three. Carter with the rebound. Turnaround. Another one. That's a base. Vince runs into Theo. He throws it up in. And it's crossover.
I'm sorry, did he just start screaming more onions?
The floor, crossover, onions, more onions.
Yeah, he did. Why? Vince Carter means more to the Toronto Raptors than any other individual does to most franchises. They might not even be in Toronto anymore had the human highlight reel not arrived. You know, the Grizzlies play in Memphis now for a reason. If you didn't know who Vince Carter was and I just gave you my loose explanation of his game, you would think I'm talking about Michael Jordan with a 3-point shot. Well, on offense anyways. And as I say that, I can feel some of you rolling your eyes through the screen, and I know that comparison comes off as pretty hyperbolic, but I promise it's really only a very slight exaggeration. VC was not only a terrifying downhill threat, but he also had a really solid mid-range game. His percentages weren't off the charts by any means, but this was the dead ball era that we're talking about. He had a good handle, decent back to the basket game, and was a 40% three-point shooter on what, for his time, was a pretty damn high volume of threes. In fact, in 2001, he finished with 162 three-pointers made, which was 6th in the NBA, also finishing 6th in three-point percentage among players who hit at least 100 threes. Now, unfortunately, Vince wasn't able to take the Raptors to the promised land, as they pretty routinely failed to put a good roster around him, and even when they had good teammates for Vince, like his cousin Tracy McGrady, they'd end up leaving for a stateside team anyways. The furthest he got them was round 2 versus the Philadelphia 76ers in 2001. The series was extremely close the whole way through, as Vince and AI went bucket for bucket. Both averaged 30 plus, while their next highest scoring teammate averaged 16. Vince had a 50-point performance in a blowout victory in Game 3, where he had an NBA playoff record 8 threes in the first half, breaking the record that was previously established by the GOAT in the Shrug game. Meanwhile, Iverson had a couple of 50 pieces of his own, dropping 54 in Game 2 and 52 in a pivotal Game 5. There aren't many playoff series that you can say feature 3 different 50-point performances. This matchup would come down to the wire, going to a Game 7 in Philadelphia. Toronto found themselves down 6 with 3 minutes to go until Antonio Davis got a layup to drop, and then Del Curry hit a gutsy transition 3 with just under a minute left on the game clock, making it a 1-point game. After 2 missed jumpers from Philly in an attempt to extend the lead to 3, Toronto got a chance to win the game with 2 seconds on the clock. And who else would take that shot but Vince Sanity himself?
Carter trying to get free. Carter at the buzzer. No good. And the Sixers hold on and advance to the conference finals.
After getting a decent look, Vince narrowly missed a long 2 out of the corner that would have been the first Game 7 buzzer beater in NBA history. After falling just 1 point short of a conference finals appearance, where they would have met the Milwaukee Bucks in a series that they definitely could have won, Toronto wouldn't make the playoffs ever again in the Vince Carter era. And after a few years of failed season after failed season, Vince would ask out of Toronto and head to the New Jersey Nets, who had just made an NBA Finals appearance. This was a fairly ugly exit. It wasn't as normal as it is today for a guy like Vince to ask out of a bad situation in his prime. And with him being essentially the guy who put the Raps on the map, fans felt abandoned and angry as a result.
That's one of the things James does well. Carter. Wow. Just laid a Canadian brick. Vaughn, ball movement. Carter is booed. Wow. That's his second air ball.
In hindsight, 3 straight years with no playoff appearances and nothing resembling an all-star teammate made for a fairly reasonable basis for asking for a trade, which is part of why decades later, it seems as though that animosity has passed and Raptors fans are largely recognizing Carter for his impact on the franchise. In the years following his departure, Toronto didn't show many signs that things would change much. They drafted Chris Bosh at the end of Vince's tenure and even managed to make the playoffs a few times, but he ended up leaving as well, as he was more of a complimentary star miscast as a lead option. He would go on to win 2 titles with the Miami Heat. Now, funny enough, just like with Vince, Toronto's next star player was added at the tail end of Bosch's time there, as in 2009, the Raps drafted DeMar DeRozan with the 9th pick.
DeRozan throws down a nasty slam. Gives it to DeRozan. DeRozan's fading. What a tough shot. And it goes! has it stripped. Here's Lowry to the cutting. DeRozan spinning and banks it in. DeRozan backs in, falling away, jumpers up and good with 1.9 remaining.
DeMar DeRozan was an old-school bucket getter. The Compton native was either getting to the rim for the slam or killing the defense with the mid-range jumper, and there was nothing they could do about it. Whether or not that shot would go in had little to do with his defender's contest. Unfortunately, this left some room to be desired for his all-around game, especially his defense, as well as his lack of a three-point shot. But as far as franchise players go, you can absolutely do worse than D Rose. DeMar was alright in his rookie year, but would jump to 17 points per game in year 2 in a bigger role, and would remain around that average till 2013, where he would make the All-Star leap. This correlated with a serious breakout from a veteran point guard in his second year in Toronto, and his 8th overall in the NBA.
Nice feed, two-handed slam.
3 to tie. Lowry, half-court heave, a prayer at the buzzer.
Kyle Lowry was a late bloomer, likely because he was a journeyman for most of his career to this point. Kyle was a Swiss Army knife, a strong defender, playmaker, and shooter, in particular as a pull-up three-point shooter and especially out of the pick and roll. He was also basically the spirit of the Raptors for his entire tenure, so much so he became known as Mr. Raptor, an excellent teammate and leader. He technically wouldn't make the All-Star team in his first breakout season despite putting up similar numbers to his later All-Star years, but these two as a backcourt glowing up at the exact same time suddenly gave Toronto something to believe in.
So when I came, I just wanted to bring that feeling back when I used to watch Vince. I used to watch Vince, them early games back in LA, early in the morning, playing on the weekends, him scoring 50 on, ESPN, little things like that, and the excitement that everybody had for the Raptors.
They would make the playoffs for the first time in half a decade, facing the failed attempt at a super team in Brooklyn led by Paul Pierce, Joe Johnson, and Darren Williams. Brook Lopez missed the series with an injury, and KG was washed and on the bench at this point, so it was a very winnable series, but Toronto's inexperience would show throughout, particularly for DeMar DeRozan, as in Game 7, DeMar went 5 for 12 with 18 points, getting outscored by his teammate and fellow Raptors legend Amir Johnson in just half of the playing time. In that game, though, Toronto had a shot to win it. Once again down 1, with just a few seconds remaining, the ball ended up in the hands of Mr. Raptor himself, and this happened.
Lowry, Williams, the tight defense. Here is Lowry on the deck, through 2. Lowry put it up, it's blocked by Pierce, and the Nets win the series! As Paul Pierce waiting in front of the rim.
Toronto would lose by 1 point in a Game 7 yet again. Disappointment, underperformance, and underwhelming clutch time play would unfortunately become the staple of Toronto playoff basketball for the foreseeable future of the Lowry-DeRozan era. They would go on to be swept by the Washington Wizards in the following season, while DeMar shot 40% from the field and Lowry shot 31%. Not ideal. Kyle would make the All-NBA third team in the following year, entering the 20 points per game club, and as a result, Toronto won 56 games and had genuine championship aspirations. They would go much further than the first round this time, but they did so in a pretty ugly and, well, just downright pathetic way. First, they beat Paul George's Indiana Pacers after things had fallen apart. PG himself was great, but there was no reason for this to be a 7-game series. However, Lowry and DeRozan both shot 31% from the field for the entire series. Next, they were facing the Miami Heat, but again as a shell of their former selves since LeBron had left 2 seasons ago, and it was just Wade and Bosh doing the best that they could. Yet again, a series that shouldn't have gone to 7 did exactly that. This time around, DeMar and Lowry didn't perform as pathetically, but they were still around 40% from the field for the whole series. So they limped their way to the conference finals, getting 2 cupcake matchups against formerly great teams, but they wouldn't get so lucky the third time around. They would brush up with the devil himself. Or at least the devil if you're literally any Eastern Conference playoff team between the years 2011 and 2018, and especially if you're the Raptors. Luckily for Toronto, Kyle and DeMar finally stopped dragging their heels and showed up, resulting in a 6-game series when it would have been a sweep had the Cavs bothered to pick up the broom. But while I commend them, they were no match for the King on his most important mission.
Kyrie Irving with a steal. 3-on-1. Alley-oop to James. Tries to draw the offensive foul. Nice pass again, and Thompson will finish. James on the run. Dragged down, and he still gets it to go. Drag it down. James on the drive.
An Eastern Conference Finals appearance in year 2 of this star duo isn't anything to complain about, but given how poorly they played to get there, managing to fail upwards, and how clearly LeBron showed that there were levels to this, it still seemed like Toronto had a lot of growing up to do. In the following season, DeRozan would have his best year yet, averaging 27 points a game and making the All-NBA third team, while Lowry was still an all-star, putting up career-high scoring numbers. But unfortunately, they would face Cleveland again, this time in round 2. DeMar underperformed in the series yet again, and LeBron averaged a casual 36. Not a recipe for success, to say the least.
Cavaliers trying to go up 3-0. LeBron James working against Ibaka, stares him down, and that in favor of the Cavaliers. Backing down, left hand. Wow, shot. Open shot. Scat. Oh, they double team, but it leads to this. Irving off the back. James fading. Another great shot.
Thus far, I've painted a cynical picture of this era of Raptors basketball, but there was a light at the end of the tunnel. After losing to the greatest team of all time in the 2017 finals, Kyrie Irving would ask out of Cleveland, and they would get back a broken Isaiah Thomas as well as Jay Crowder. Cleveland was now super vulnerable, and the Eastern Conference was seemingly wide open. Toronto took full advantage of this in the regular season, having their best year in franchise history, winning 59 games, playing a new brand of basketball that emphasized team play, going from a 30th in the league in assists to 6th. This was due in large part to their assistant coach Nick Nurse making some major changes to the offense, even admitting that their goal was to create more assisted baskets. In a preseason article with The Athletic in 2017, where Eric Corrine writes, Nurse had been on the Raptors coaching staff since Masai Ujiri became the team president in 2013. Nurse was seen as an offensive expert, someone who would help the Raptors improve on that end, given their head coach Dwayne Casey having his tactical expertise lay on the defensive end of the floor. And speaking of defense, their new addition of Serge Ibaka also helped make them a top 5 defense for the first time in this era. They were riding high going into the postseason. They won in 6 versus Washington, despite John Wall and Bradley Beal both being on heaters, but then they had to walk into the belly of the beast yet again. But it's okay. Everything's okay. Sure, it's LeBron James, but his roster is awful. LeBron just had a nearly 35% usage rate in a grueling 7-game series. He only had one teammate average double-digit points, and that was Kevin Love, averaging 11 on 33% shooting. They are vulnerable. This is the time to take down the king. Yeah, no. Turns out, that light at the end of the tunnel I was talking about was a trap, giving Toronto a glimmer of hope just so that LeBron could crush their spirit one more time.
Shot clock for LeBron James. Hold on. We're speechless, Hubie Brown. Backing down Lowry. Heat check. Still sizzling. LeBron fades away over Siakam. LeBron backing down DeRozan.
There's that fadeaway, and it's Butter.
Under
3 seconds to go. Throws up the floater. Oh, good night.
Jesus Christ, man. Look, I don't know what LeBron has against Toronto. Maybe he hates the anthem. It's definitely kind of mid. Perhaps he's just watched too much South Park, you know, blame Canada and all that. Maybe he's against universal healthcare. I don't know. Either way, the Raptors were behind one of the most embarrassing playoff losses in the history of this league. LeBron averaged 34, 11, and 8 with 3 stocks, and it wasn't just that he did that, but how he did it. Toronto didn't do an awful job guarding the guy by any means. Their goal was to force LeBron to be a jump shooter, use their strong interior defense from Ibaka to keep him away from the rim, and if he beats you on middies, then so be it. Well, he beat them on middies. He couldn't fucking miss them. Toronto's historic season resulted in a devastating loss. Even though Kyle Lowry had a statistically strong series, DeMar DeRozan, on the other hand, averaged a measly 16.8 points, a 6.2 point per game drop-off from the regular season with an 8% dip in true shooting percentage. Now, on a positive note, after predictably losing to the Warriors in his 8th straight finals appearance, LeBron would move west to the LA Lakers, so he would no longer exist as an obstacle. But even if they did get past LeBron, their odds of beating Curry and KD's Warriors in the finals were virtually non-existent. And when it comes to Toronto's best scorer, DeMar DeRozan, he has proven to be pretty unreliable in the biggest moments. From 2013 to 2018, in the regular season, DeMar averaged 23.4 points on 54% true shooting. In the 51 playoff games he played for Toronto over that same span, he averaged 21.9 on 50% true shooting, with many of his biggest underperformances coming in elimination games. Toronto's team president, Masai Ujiri, made the decision to trade D. Rose while Kyle Lowry and company stuck around. And that is how Toronto ended up primed to trade for a disgruntled superstar. Kawhi has found himself in a precarious narrative situation yet again. He's just made a big mess in San Antonio, justified or not. He's also just joined a team that everybody knows isn't one of his preferred destinations of LA and LA. Not to mention, of course, his injury concerns that might throw a wrench into this whole equation at any point. Luckily for Kawhi Leonard, he was joining a pretty fucking excellent team.
Magruder denying Siakam. Kyle. T.
Obviously, I've introduced you to Kyle Lowry already, but he adjusted his game this season, reducing his scoring volume as it became less necessary in the context of this team, focusing more on his playmaking, averaging 1.8 more assists per game. With his help, the Raptors remained one of the best passing teams in the league. One of his favorite targets for his dimes was a former late first-round pick in his 3rd year, a Cameroonian forward who was having a breakout season.
Possessions out. You see Tobias Harris starting off on.
Pascal Siakam is an essential piece in all of this. Beyond the gamble of trading for Kawhi, Toronto had also gambled on their young players developing into genuine rotation pieces. Young players who had shown upside, but were by no means sure things. Siakam would more than prove his viability, not just as a rotation piece, but as the second scoring option on the team, averaging 17 points per game, a 10-point per game leap from the previous season, which resulted in him running away with the Most Improved Player award. As a scorer, Siakam was both an excellent rim runner without the ball and an excellent slasher with it. His jump shot was inconsistent, but worthy of the defense's respect, and while he wasn't an extraordinary passer, you would seldom find him failing to make the right play. These three were the primary driving forces of Toronto's offense, and paired with them in the starting lineup would be two excellent floor spacers and defenders.
Danny Green for 3. Bang!
In the paint. Crowded. Gasol to tie it, and he does!
Danny Green came along with Kawhi in the trade, and while you can't say he did anything like that exceptional, the fact is every NBA team needs someone like Danny Green. He played excellent defense, and while his jumper could be inconsistent, his reputation still made him an effective spacer. The other defensive-minded floor spacer also came by trade, but it was actually mid-season. Marc Gasol, a former Defensive Player of the Year, was acquired from the Memphis Grizzlies near the trade deadline. But this was only possible because of a last-second decision by a third team. See, Marc had just came into his own as a three-point shooter, as this was the brief part of a three-point revolution where centers with a soft touch started trying their luck from three more often. But this was too little too late for Memphis, as the grit and grind era had all but officially come to an end. So the Grizzlies finally pulled the plug on their 2019 season and decided to get some assets for one of their aging all-time greats. A deal was reportedly complete between the Charlotte Hornets and Memphis Grizzlies, but Charlotte backed out because Gasol apparently refused to commit to them beyond the remainder of the season. So at the buzzer, Gasol was sent to Toronto on February 7th, 2019 for Jonas Valanciunas, DeLon Wright, CJ Miles, and a 2024 second-round pick. Jonas Valanciunas was a solid starting center, but not really what Toronto needed, with Pascal breaking out as an interior scorer at the power forward spot. A 5 who could space the floor would be more optimal. In the 30 games Siakam played with Valanciunas that year, he averaged 14.5 points per game. In the 26 he played with Marc, he averaged 20.1. This would play a large part in Siakam averaging 19 points per game throughout that year's playoffs. But on top of floor spacing, Gasol, while not quite at the 2013 DPOY levels of his prime, was still a phenomenal defender. He used his size well and was exceptionally smart when it came to his positioning and communication. And on top of that, he was an excellent passer for a 5, averaging 3.9 assists per game. That was an underrated aspect of this team. Lowry, Kawhi, Siakam, and Gasol were all good to great passers, resulting in the Raptors consistently getting a good shot. Not to mention that they had another great playmaker coming off of the bench at the point guard position. Fred was another one of those young guys that the Raptors had gambled on. In his second season in 2018, Fred actually miraculously ended up third in a 2-man, 6-man of the year race. I say miraculously because his numbers are substantially worse than players who received less votes, and the 6-man of the year award is typically nothing if not a points per game contest. Either way, he looked good off of the bench, especially as a shooter, hitting 41.4% of his 3.5 attempts from 3 a night. Fred proved to be worth the gamble, like Siakam, averaging 11 points and 5 assists while remaining a great 3-point shooter in 27 minutes of action a game. Fred wasn't always the first man off of the bench though. Sometimes it would be their defensive phenom with a silky smooth mid-range jumper who could play the 4 or the 5. The one and only Serge Ibaka.
Puts a shot up, his own rebound. Ibaka for the lead. Good! Serge Ibaka.
I mentioned Mr. Ibaka already, but his value to these Raptors is often overlooked. Like Gasol, he wasn't quite his peak self on this team, especially when it comes to the eye-popping block numbers, but he remained one of the best defenders in the league, still being a good rim protector and providing a ton of versatility with his ability to play the 4 on both ends, moving his feet well on defense and pairing well next to Marc Gasol since Marc had a 3-point shot. With his ability to play the 4, Siakam's ability to play the 3, and Kawhi's ability to run the 2, Toronto would be able to run lineups with a terrifying amount of length and versatility on the defensive end. And considering that Lowry and Fred were no slouches on D despite being undersized, and Danny Green was also a terrific defender, any combination of players Toronto would put on the floor was going to be an elite defensive unit no matter what. To top everything else off, there was also a head coaching change. Though this one is a bit controversial because Toronto's aforementioned assistant coach Nick Nurse would be replacing Dwayne Casey, who was fired despite winning Coach of the Year. In fact, because of the now defunct NBA awards show that happened after the postseason, Casey received his Coach of the Year award after being fired. Ouch. Well, I don't think this firing was necessary for their success. At the very least, Nick Nurse was a damn good head coach in his own right, actually winning Coach of the Year himself in just his second year with Toronto. This time, they didn't fire him afterwards, or at least not immediately. They did 3 seasons later. Anyways, this is your 2019 Toronto Raptors squad, stacked top to bottom with elite defenders, decision makers, and shooters, all led by our protagonist Kawhi Leonard. He had all the pieces around him necessary to go on a revenge tour. That is, so long as his body would allow it. Going into the 2018-19 regular season, the Toronto Raptors were given the 5th best odds at winning a championship. The best odds that they had ever been given, but still considered worse than the Celtics, who had just fallen a game short of a finals appearance without their best player Kyrie Irving, and not even favored over LeBron James in LA pre-Anthony Davis. They were by no means expected to run through the league. Toronto would end up as the 2nd seed in the East, winning 58 games. Kawhi would average a casual 26-7 during the regular season, but of course, we wouldn't be talking about this team if it weren't for the playoffs, so let's get to those. In round 1, they would face the Magic. DJ Augustine would hit a game winner in game 1 and then get swept in the remaining games. Not much of interest to report here, so we're going to quickly move on. But don't worry, things are heating up in round 2. See, with the East this year being perceived as fairly wide open, there were a handful of teams ready to go all in.
Breaking news, wow. Jimmy Butler has been traded to the Philadelphia 76ers.
The Clippers and the Sixers agreed to a deal that will send Tobias Harris to Philly.
The Sixers were already a big enough threat with the foundation of Joel Embiid and Ben Simmons, which had just won 52 games in the season prior. But now, being added to that was a disgruntled Jimmy Butler from the Minnesota Timberwolves, arguably a top 10 player in the league, an excellent shot creator inside the arc, and a dog on the defensive end, and as a leader, which wasn't always a good thing for Philly, but that's a story for another day. On top of that, Tobias Harris was the best scorer on a Clippers team that refused to be bad despite losing the key pieces from the Lob City era. He ended up in Philly, finally giving the Clippers a chance to properly tank, but they still persisted and narrowly made the 8th seed without him. And as a floor-spacing shot-creating 4, he made for a perfect 4th option on offense. But honestly, what order the options were depended entirely on what game it was, because with JJ Redick as their perfect 5th starter, the Sixers' scoring was distributed insanely well among their starters. Joel obviously led with 27 points per game, but Ben, Jimmy, JJ, and Harris all averaged 17 to 18 points per game. These 76ers would make for an extremely formidable opponent for Toronto in round 2. Kawhi had a 45-point Game 1 performance that would put the Raptors on top to start the series.
Marjanovic ranged over, but it's one-on-one. It's a fade, and he makes it look so easy. Leonard gets inside, and it's just effortless right now. Leonard squares.
But Philly would get a huge win in Game 2, stealing home court from the Raptors. This despite a 2-for-7 performance from Joel Embiid, thanks to a 30-piece from Jimmy Butler, including 7 points in a tight final 3 minutes.
Butler, that goes. Two defenders. Finds Butler. Oh, Jimmy Butler, bullseye.
Game 3 would also go to Philly, this time led by an Embiid 30-piece.
Embiid for 3. Embiid fakes, Embiid down the lane.
But Toronto would render the Sixers stealing home court irrelevant by tying it up in Philadelphia, this thanks to a 39-point, 15-rebound performance from Kawhi on an astonishing 77% true shooting.
See, Embiid switches, fires a long one, nothing but net.
Joel Embiid also kind of shit the bed again. Game 5 is said to be the most important, as if a series is tied up, the team that wins Game 5 has 1 game of room for error. The loser of Game 5 has to be perfect to come out on top. Toronto made sure to gain this room for error because holy shit did they beat the crap out of Philly in Game 5, posting a final score of 125-89. Yeesh.
Ibaka, the fake, and the Statue of Liberty dunk. Lowry, chance it.
Leonard makes his move. Just 1 point off the halftime lead.
Kawhi was fantastic, but in no way did he carry his team this time. This was a team effort with a fairly even scoring distribution as all 5 starters scored in double digits and worked tirelessly to eat up every bit of space on the defensive end. It was a good thing they gained that margin of error though, because Philly managed to hang on in Game 6, with this also coming mostly from a team effort, but also Ben Simmons had his only remotely good game in the series.
Hangs, can't finish. Oh, Simmons! TNT will have that. Here's Butler, alley-oop, and Simmons with the putdown.
Now, we moved through those games fairly quickly, because for the most part, while the series was close, the games themselves were not. Luckily, both of these teams gave us the blessing of saving the best game of the series for last. Game 7 was an old-school, grinded-out dogfight. Neither team's star-level players shot the ball efficiently. Kawhi Leonard would finish the game with 41 points, but it took 39 shots and 8 free throw attempts to get there. And to make matters worse, his teammates couldn't hit a shot. Every starter shot in the 30s percentage-wise. Fred VanVleet would even go 0 for 5. Serge Ibaka was the only player who had an even average efficiency, scoring 17 points on 6 for 10 shooting, also hitting 3 threes. Going into the fourth quarter, Toronto was up 3 at 67-64. Ibaka started the quarter off with a tough corner 3 that really had no business going in. Then Kawhi and Jimmy Butler traded a few buckets. Philly wasn't exactly shooting the ball super well either, and Jimmy for the game shot it poorly, but he and Kawhi both had no issue hitting their shots in the fourth. Jimmy went 3 for 5 with 10 points, and Kawhi scored 15 on a scorching 6 for 9 shooting. He was locked in for crunch time. Toronto had briefly lost the lead, but Kyle Lowry took it back with this difficult shot to beat the buzzer. With Ibaka having the hot hand, Nick Nurse opted to close the game with him at the 4, Kawhi at the 2, and Siakam at the 3. The ability to run a lineup like that is what made Toronto so deadly. The defense was suffocating, and on offense, because Ibaka was hitting his threes and Kawhi was an unstoppable one-on-one force, they got by despite some sometimes awkward spacing. Kawhi would continue to hit difficult shot after difficult shot. With 3.5 minutes to go, JJ Redick hit an and one mid-range with the extra point. That tied it up at 85 points apiece. After a 2-minute scoring drought from both teams, Kawhi hit a long 2-pointer off of a Siakam screen. Embiid wasn't in drop coverage, but he started to backpedal, anticipating the drive. Following this possession, Toronto locked up for a full 23 seconds just to get a steal in the final second. This put Toronto up 4 with just under a minute remaining. Philly would proceed to draw 2 fouls, with Butler splitting a pair and Embiid making both, making it a 1-point game with 12 seconds on the clock. They would foul Kawhi on the inbound, but he would miss his second free throw, and the Raptors would fail to get set in transition. Toronto calls timeout, and they have 4.2 seconds remaining to get a shot off to avoid overtime. I mean, you already know what happens, but I'm going to play it anyways.
Off to Leonard, defended by Simmons. Is this the dagger?
Kawhi Leonard hits what would be the most iconic shot in his career, in the history of Toronto basketball, and just outright one of the most iconic shots in the history of basketball, period. The first, and to this point, only game-winning buzzer beater in a Game 7. That shot gave Kawhi 41 on the game, with him finishing the series averaging just under 35 points per game, as well as a series-high 10 rebounds. With that, Toronto was advancing, and the team that they would meet in the conference finals, oddly enough, looked a lot like the team that the 2001 Raptors failed to meet. These Milwaukee Bucks were even led by a guy wearing the same number. The Bucks had signed Brook Lopez in the offseason, which elevated Giannis to his first MVP award and the Bucks to a 60-win record. A small but devastatingly effective addition really unlocked how this team played and brought them from a fun, pretty good playoff team to a legit contender led by first-time MVP Giannis Antetokounmpo. There was one key difference, though, between this team and the roster that would go on to eventually win a title 2 seasons later, and that difference was the point guard position. Eric Bledsoe was a really strong slasher and defender, a pretty good playmaker as well. He even earned the nickname Mini LeBron somehow, but unfortunately, his jumper was pretty god-awful. This created a huge advantage for Toronto, who could sag off of Bledsoe and load up on Giannis, putting a ton of pressure on him on ball and presenting a backline of defense that would make getting to the rim very difficult. This defensive scheme was called The Wall. Kawhi or Siakam would take on the initial matchup versus Giannis, while Gasol or Ibaka would wait in the paint, ready to help when necessary. Giannis could kick it out to his teammates to punish the defense for giving him so much attention, but then those teammates wouldn't hit their shots. Eric Bledsoe shot 17% from outside, and worse yet, Lopez shot 31%, and Chris Middleton, while he did hit his threes, was overall struggling to score the ball. So Giannis was forced to either drive into a ton of traffic or pass out to teammates who were probably going to miss the shot. It was a no-win scenario for Milwaukee. As a credit to his greatness, Giannis still pushed this thing to 6, despite the nightmare matchup, and the Raptors would end up playing a large part in his development as a player, and how badly Eric Bledsoe got exposed was also instrumental in the Bucks eventually acquiring Drew Holiday down the line. I kind of feel like the 2019 Raptors in a smaller subtext were essentially like the bad boy Pistons to Giannis's Michael Jordan. Anyways, the series was tied up after 4, with Toronto winning Game 4 off of an absolute heater from Fred VanVleet, who had just become a father. The next 2 games in the series would be won on excellent clutch execution from the Raptors and continued hot shooting from Father Fred. In Game 5, Fred hit 7 3-pointers, and in the 4th, they outscored Milwaukee 33-24, and in Game 6, Fred had 14 on 4 of 5 shooting from 3, and in the 4th, Toronto outscored the Bucks 29-18. Milwaukee just wasn't ready.
The Raptors were just 2 games behind the Milwaukee Bucks in the regular season. They're off the bench to celebrate.
I want to take now to point out how much the Raptors fan base brought to the table for this championship. Looking for clips for this video, there were multiple instances where Toronto's crowd was so damn loud that you couldn't even hear what the announcers were saying. You could really feel how much this meant to them as this run was happening. Waiting for the Raptors in the finals were the Golden State Warriors. Kawhi was once again facing the team that put him on this path to Toronto to begin with. This time, they wouldn't get off so easy. Round 1 versus the Clippers went to 6, which is 2 games more than it should have been. Then in round 2 versus Houston, Kevin Durant would go down with an injury that would sideline him for the remainder of the Western Conference playoffs and would make him questionable to appear in the finals. The Dubs managed to still make it out of the West without too much struggle, this primarily because Steph Curry was their best player. But it would be pretty difficult to beat Toronto without Durant, as they had sacrificed their depth to add him to the roster. So while they still had their original big 3, they weren't super well equipped. A lot of people hold this against the Raptors, and sure, if I were a betting man and KD had played this whole series, my money would have been on Golden State, and I probably wouldn't have won a lot, but I don't think it was a guaranteed outcome by any means. Remember how well Kawhi played the Warriors when they were at their absolute best in 2017? Well, now consider how much better of a roster Toronto was, especially how well they'd match up defensively. While I think Golden State would have won, this team would have been the biggest challenge the KD Warriors would ever face. With all of that said, how did they play the team in front of them? The Raptors won Game 1 on their home floor despite Curry and Klay combining for 55 and Draymond Green getting the most bare minimum triple-double possible. Kawhi actually struggled offensively, but Siakam had an outstanding shooting night, going 14 for 17 from the field. Marc Gasol also had a 20-piece, and Fred VanVleet continued his hot shooting. Golden State managed to win Game 2 off of their defense, as basically everybody struggled for both teams in this game. They won narrowly 109-104. Klay and Draymond both had really strong games, but unfortunately Klay's game would end on a sour note.
Trying to draw a foul here, spreads his legs and lands awkwardly, and progressively looks like it just starts to bother him more and more until finally on that last possession he's calling for a foul.
With Klay now out of the picture, Toronto really had a wide open pathway towards their first title, as they had pretty much nobody else to worry about on the offensive end. The Raptors decided to take full advantage of this by running a box and one on Stephen Curry in Game 3, a defensive strategy that combines man and zone defense. The focal point of the offense gets the one-on-one matchup, while the other four players form a zone in a box shape. Now, how did this strategy work out for Toronto? Well,
in the playoffs, they're 5-1. Curry for three. Curry, foul line jumper. Curry shake and bake, three-pointer. It goes! Steph Curry with a bounce.
Yeah, Steph ended up doing plenty of damage regardless of occupying all of the attention from one of the best defensive teams in NBA history. That didn't change the outcome in the win-loss column, though. Curry had 47 on 63% true shooting, but the Warriors outside of him had just 62 points and had just a 46% true shooting percentage. Just not enough when Toronto's starting lineup alone combined for 106 points with some insane scoring distribution. There was hope on the horizon for Golden State in Game 4, however, because Klay Thompson was back, so the defense could no longer focus exclusively on Curry. And he came back like he hadn't skipped a beat, scoring 28 on 78% true shooting. But once again, there just wasn't much offensive support besides for their backcourt. Curry and Klay had combined for 55 points again, but the rest of the team scored just 37. Meanwhile, Kawhi had a 36-piece and Serge Ibaka scored 20 in 21 minutes off of the bench. So Golden State had gone down 3-1 in the finals. But hey, perhaps this is an opportunity to make up for their past blunder. Maybe they could be the next team to come back from 3-1, and it seemed as though that was a genuine possibility because despite not really being ready yet, Golden State was putting Kevin Durant back in the action. And at first, it looked like Toronto might have good reason to be scared.
Curry to Durant. Here's his first shot. Yeah, it looks pretty good there. Durant for three. Kevin Durant, his third three-pointer already.
Just like that, Durant had scored 11 points in 11 minutes, putting Golden State up 6 after the first quarter. But then, this happened.
Ibaka trying to stay with Durant, knocks it away, and Durant slipping. Durant goes down holding his leg.
Yeah, Durant's already bad injury just got a whole lot worse. Unfortunately, this was an Achilles tear that would sideline him for a year. Still, Durant did give them somewhat of a lead, and Golden State still managed to be just good enough to maintain that lead. Toronto took said lead back, being up 3 with a minute and a half remaining, but then the Splash Brothers would happen.
Curry gets a look, fires away, ties the game! Back out to Green, Thompson, one fake, one dribble, one shot, got it! Golden State retakes the lead.
The Raptors would get a chance to win it at the buzzer, but Draymond Green had different plans.
6 seconds remaining. Leonard, back up Van Fleet. Van Fleet kicks it out Lowry. Lowry for the win. Won't go. And there'll be a Game 6 in Oakland.
Game 6 was also fairly close. Steph struggled shooting the ball, but Klay had an efficient 30, and Draymond had a monster stat line of 11 points, 13 assists, 19 rebounds, and 5 stocks. Andre Iguodala also stepped up big time, scoring 22 points, the most points he had in a playoff game since round 1 versus the Rockets in 2016. This was another game where Kawhi kinda struggled to shoot the ball, but Siakam and Lowry were able to step up to mitigate that, both scoring 26. Meanwhile, Father Fred had 22 points, meaning since Game 4 versus the Bucks onward, he had averaged 14.7 points a night. Fatherhood really does change you, I guess. It was looking like Golden State might actually push this thing to 7, as the Warriors had a heater of a third quarter, with Klay Thompson scoring 12 on 4 of 5 shooting. Unfortunately, 2 of those points came at the free throw line after this happened.
Thompson running the floor, and a foul. And Thompson grabs his left knee, now writhing in pain. Steph Curry slamming the ball on the court, so upset.
Yeah, that right there pretty much sealed the series, as once again Steph was stranded as the lone scoring option, and they were able to hold him to 1 of 6 shooting in the fourth quarter, winning the quarter by 6 and the game by 4. Maybe not the most storybook final series in the world, definitely not what you'd want it to be in an ideal world, but hey, you can only play who's in front of you. And regardless of how you view these injuries and their effect on the series, the end result is all the same.
Now the Warriors just inbound, and that's it. There's the new NBA champion, and it's a team from Toronto, Canada. We, the North, are now we, the champions, the Raptors, the 2019 NBA champs.
73 years after the Huskies wrote the city of Toronto into NBA history, Toronto themselves would hoist the Larry O'Brien Trophy. Something that honestly seemed like it might never happen. The Raptors were absolutely the type of NBA franchise that just doesn't win a title. But thanks to a massive gamble by Masai Ujiri and a whole bunch of pieces falling perfectly into place, the franchise earned its first and currently only title. And as for our main character,
I just want to say thank y'all for welcoming me here. After the trade with open arms, man, it made my experience that much better. This group of guys let me do what I do on the floor. Coach Nick let me do what I do. And now we got a championship.
he had proven definitively that he was capable of leading a championship team on his own. Separate from the influence of Pop, he was his own man. He was a superstar and a champion, and nobody could take that from him. For the playoffs as a whole, he averaged 30.5 points, which is the 11th highest anyone has ever averaged on a title run, and the 5th highest by someone not named Michael Jordan. So for all intents and purposes, Kawhi essentially had a Jordan-esque championship run. One of the greatest seasons any NBA player has ever had, and he did it in fucking Toronto, a team that he had no interest in playing for. And yet, despite that looming over them all season, Kawhi and his excellent supporting cast executed time and time again on their way to a championship parade at Nathan Phillips Square. And for a moment, it seemed as though that there was nothing to do but celebrate. But people had been speculating since the day he was traded that there was almost no chance that the Raptors would be able to re-sign him. That even if they somehow won a championship over the Warriors, the Claw would leave the harsh Canadian winters for the comforts of home in California. And doubts that he'd re-sign may have only subsided during these 4 seconds. The team was poised to contend for titles for years to come, and the city was embracing him about as much as they had ever embraced anyone. So it stood to reason that if Kawhi were to stay in Toronto, then this championship with the added potential for a dynasty run would override his previous ambitions. Right? Right?
Don't let me leave, Murph. Don't let me leave, Murph.
I just want to take a second to point out how improbable all of this was. There's so many different things that could have gone wrong that it's only worth the gamble if you've got nothing left. Honestly, LeBron did Toronto a favor by beating their ass to the degree that he did in 2018. As weird as that is to say, even after pulling off the trade of the summer, barely managing to add Marc Gasol because the Hornets got cold feet was unlikely, and yet it happened. Pascal Siakam and Fred VanVleet both needed to come into this season much better than they were before, and despite that also being unlikely, Pascal did it so well he won Most Improved Player and averaged 19 points per game in the playoffs, while Fred ended up being the most impactful sixth man of the playoffs, straight up winning them a handful of key games, which seemed like the epitome of unlikely. Then, of course, on the less positive side, Golden State had a series of injuries that definitely made things easier, while injuries shaping playoff series isn't all of that out of the ordinary in general. The magnitude of the injuries the Warriors suffered was by no means business as usual. Add to it that this is the Toronto Raptors that we're talking about. Don't get me wrong, the Raptors are a surprisingly competent franchise historically. They've made the playoffs 13 times in 29 seasons, despite their stretch of missing them with Vince and their early expansion era growing pains. It's not great, but it ain't bad. However, like I said, the Raptors were definitely the type of franchise that just doesn't win a championship in the NBA. There are plenty of franchises that will remain without one because they won't ever be hit with the trifecta of competent management, a home run trade opportunity, and extraordinary luck in player development, coaching, and even injuries for both their roster and their opponents. By all conventional sensibilities around what's supposed to happen in the NBA, these Raptors should have never won a championship, and yet they did anyways. We as NBA fans love to talk about what ifs, and I feel like often the what if is what we think should have happened, like what in our head makes more sense than reality. But this run was one of those moments in NBA history where the chaos proved to be one of the league's strongest attributes. Because, like, what is this story? The way Kawhi got there was insane. The set of circumstances required for his relationship with the Spurs to have gone the way that it did when it did is insane. Then you factor in LeBron's historic dominance against the Raptors being so significant that it overrode the dramatic difference in roster and coaching quality. Like, if LeBron won that series in 6 or 7 instead of sweeping them, I don't know if Masai pulls the trigger on that deal given the unknown that Kawhi was with his injury history and impending free agency. But clearly it's a good thing he did, because it was one of the dominoes in a series of unlikely events that resulted in a title run the likes of which we will probably never see ever again. The curse of the Los Angeles Clippers comes from a rich history of being one of the most embarrassing franchises in the history of sports. It took them more than 50 years just to get past the second round of the playoffs. But contrary to their historic reputation as losers, they've quietly been one of the winningest teams in the NBA for well over a decade. They have the longest active streak of winning seasons in the NBA at 13.5 seasons, having not finished below 500 since they acquired Chris Paul in the 2011 offseason, and he left the team 7.5 years ago. The Clippers also have the second highest win percentage in the NBA since the 2011-12 season, being just a few wins behind the Warriors, who have 4 championships in that time, while LA doesn't even have a single finals appearance. The only thing they have to show for all of their recent success is breaking that 50-year streak. Everything else has been a series of unfortunate events, from blowing a 3-1 lead to playoff P to season-ending injuries, not to mention the infamous Donald Sterling scandal in the middle of it all. After Chris Paul leaving and Blake Griffin getting traded, the Lob City era ended, and LA set their sights on the NBA's next disgruntled superstar, Kawhi Leonard, who was being called the best player in the world by the 2019 offseason, fresh off of taking the Raptors to their first title in franchise history. Kawhi was supposed to be the savior of the Los Angeles Clippers franchise, the guy who would truly break their curse. Now, over 5 years removed from him joining the team, it's looking all but certain he'll just be another part of it. Especially after the team let his co-star Paul George walk in free agency. And considering what the Clippers gave up to bring these two together, a lot of people have suggested that the Clippers should regret having pursued Kawhi Leonard in the first place. So what's true? Are the Clippers foolish for investing so heavily in Kawhi? Were they destined for downfall due to their curse? Or is there something even more sinister at play? Once again, we need to do a quick rewind to catch us up on what franchise Kawhi has decided to shack up with. Back in 1970, the NBA expanded by adding 3 new franchises: the Portland Trail Blazers, Cleveland Cavaliers, and the Buffalo Braves. 2 of those teams you probably already know, as they have remained in the city where they originated and still go by the same name. The Buffalo Braves, on the other hand, are an NBA franchise lost in time. They set a shameful record that still stands today, scoring the most points in a fourth quarter ever against the Celtics on October 20th, 1972, just to still lose the game anyways, as they had entered the fourth trailing by 43 points. But on that embarrassing team that put up that humiliating record was a bright spot for the Braves' near future. See, all this historic badness resulted in the Braves landing the number 2 pick in the 1972 draft, which they used to select Bob McAdoo, who would win Rookie of the Year in 1973. But the Braves still failed to make the playoffs. It wasn't until his following season that Bob would make a superstar leap, winning both the scoring title and leading the league in field goal percentage while dragging the Braves to their first ever playoff berth. The rest of the team was less than historic, but McAdoo was talented enough alone to get them a chance to technically compete for a championship. Unfortunately for them, they would face the eventual champion Boston Celtics in round 1, and though they put up a good fight, losing was basically inevitable. The following year, 1975, Bob McAdoo would win MVP at just 23 years old, again winning the scoring title, this time bumping his average to 34.5 points. But the Braves would lose in round 1 again, this time to the Washington Bullets, and then in 1976, they'd advance in the postseason for the first time, beating the Philadelphia 76ers in overtime of Game 3 of a best-of-3 series on this free throw from Bob McAdoo, where a Sixers fan was ejected for shaking the basket before going into round 2 to once again lose to the eventual champion Celtics.
The woman shook the basket, trying to give Mack a moving target.
You know, when he made the 2 free throws to tie the game, somebody moved the basket, too. That's the second time it's happened, and the players have all complained about it.
That could be it. Going to be awful touch for the 76ers to catch Buffalo now, a 3-point lead with 17 seconds left, but they have come back, and now they call a timeout.
So up to this point, though they haven't won a championship, the Buffalo Braves started off as a pretty successful expansion team. They won a playoff series and had a superstar who already won an MVP and multiple scoring titles. But after that, shit gets really, really weird. In the 1976 offseason, the Braves would draft Adrian Dantley with the 6th overall pick, an eventual multi-time scoring champion. And soon after that, they'd land Moses Malone from the Portland Trail Blazers, who feared they wouldn't have room for him in their front court with Bill Walton and Maurice Lucas. Malone would go on to be one of the greatest players of all time, one of just 9 players in history with 3 or more MVPs, just not on the Braves. This team with 2 league MVP level big men and a guy who averaged 30 points per game for 7 seasons just completely fell apart for no good reason. Moses Malone played just 6 total minutes for the Braves before being traded to Houston. This was allegedly due to Malone being understandably unhappy about playing 3 minutes a game. It's still disputed why this went down the way that it did, with reports suggesting it being a contract dispute, but Malone would make an immediate impact on the Rockets and he'd win MVP just 2 seasons later, averaging 25 and 17. McAdoo's contract was also set to expire, so he got shipped to the Knicks in exchange for cash? They traded an MVP for cash? What on earth happened in 1976? Welcome to the Conspiracy Corner. It's a conspiracy corner because there was literally a conspiracy to sabotage the Buffalo Braves. It is just greed and billionaires doing what billionaires do, and it all starts with Kentucky Fried Chicken. We actually learned about this from a Reddit post. It's from 5 years ago from a guy named Walter Dog. It is about as well researched as it gets, especially for a Reddit post, so shout out to him. I fact-checked it about as much as I possibly could. The link to the post will be in the description if you want even further details. Alright, this is ridiculous. I gotta take this shit off. Much better. The conspirator in question was named John Y. Brown Jr. Long story short, he's a rich kid from Kentucky who, as a young entrepreneur, somehow met Colonel Sanders and bought KFC from him. Then, just 8 years later, that purchase turned into $284 million when he sold all of his stock in KFC in 1971. Which, when adjusted for inflation, would be $2.2 billion in today's money. So technically, John didn't have $1 billion to his name at that time, but he wielded the same power as a modern-day billionaire. John Y. Jr. decides to spend a part of his fortune on an ABA team, the Kentucky Colonels. It is ironic. He then appointed his wife and 10 other women to the team's board of directors. The GM quit, the coach left, and then the guy who replaced him coached for 1 year and then died. John Y. Brown Jr. then gave Hubie Brown his first ever professional head coaching gig, which is wild to think about. The Kentucky Colonels actually won an ABA championship in Hubie Brown's first season with the league's best defense, and things were good. The Kentucky Colonels weren't at risk of being relocated. They had won a championship. They got the 6th highest attendance in basketball. But John Y. Brown Jr. is claiming that he lost hundreds of thousands of dollars in the process. He ends up selling one of his best players for $500,000 in cash, who still had a good 10 years left in his career. He also came up with the idea of having the ABA versus the NBA in a head-to-head match for a $1 million prize, featuring his championship Kentucky Colonels versus the NBA champion Warriors, but the NBA said no. With the ABA merger being inevitable, it looks like the Colonels have a chance to merge into the NBA, and rather than that, he decides to fold the team for $3 million. After all of that, he just let the team stop existing for more money. Not even months later, in 1976, John Y. Brown purchased half ownership of the Buffalo Braves. So to answer the question, what on earth happened in 1976, John Y. Brown Jr. is what happened. So why did this KFC billionaire flip-flop on owning a basketball team after selling out his precious Colonels and letting them fold? Well, before John Y. Brown Jr. actually bought the Braves, another guy wanted to buy the team and move it to Miami by the name of Irving Cowan. He's a hotel guy. Probably just wanted to juice his hotel business by having 41 routine major events in immediate proximity to his hotel, but the city of Buffalo sued and the transaction did not go through because of it. John Y. Jr. knew this, and he also knew that the city of Buffalo had a certain condition in their contract with the Braves that said they needed to sell 5,000 season tickets every year, or else the agreement is void. So knowing this, and that there's a market to move the Braves to a new location, he knew that all he had to do was not sell 5,000 season tickets, and he could get out of this deal and make a better, quicker one. So in an effort not to sell season tickets, to tank the team and burn it all down, they trade away Rookie of the Year Adrian Dantley, they trade away Moses Malone, and they trade away Bob McAdoo for cash. If that trio managed to stay together, or at the very least had they gotten more out of trading them, there might very well still be a Buffalo Braves franchise to this day. But instead, a billionaire bought the team, explicitly intending to ruin its relationship with its city. This whole Clippers curse nightmare could have been avoided altogether, but some madman made sure that this is the version of history that we got. Having successfully pulled off his operation, John Y. Jr. decided to sell the team not to the first guy, Irv Cowan, but to another guy named Irv Levin. The two rich guys traded franchises. Didn't know you could do that. Irv would then move the team to San Diego, and Brown would give up his Celtics stake after some hilarious trades, beefing with Red Auerbach, and then running for governor of Kentucky, which he won. That's a story for another time. Alas, we have uncovered the origin of the Clippers curse. It's not anything mysterious. It is just a real conspiracy where a billionaire used and abused this professional basketball team to enrich himself. Going from meeting Colonel Sanders, becoming a billionaire off of KFC, being an ABA champion, and a Buffalo Braves saboteur, before ultimately giving up on his hoop dreams of sorts to just be the governor of Kentucky. But the effects of this Kentucky Fried curse would be felt by this NBA team for the rest of their existence. Yeah, shout out to the guy who made the original post on Reddit 5 years ago, WalterDog12, you are the GOAT, and this has been the Conspiracy Corner. After wiping the team of all of its talent, the Braves would see massive declines in attendance, and they would eventually move to San Diego when the team was sold, all according to John Y. Jr.'s plan. In the relocation, they would also rebrand as the Clippers. Many have actually claimed that the original name, the Braves, is actually responsible for all of the failures of the Clippers. Braves is a term that was used to refer to Native Americans, and obviously there has been much discussion since the 70s about natives being turned into caricatures for sports mascots. I don't know though. In a way, saying they were cursed by Native Americans for this name also works its way back around to still being pretty racist, so I don't know if I like that take.
There are two things I know about white people. They love Rachel Ray, and they are terrified of curses.
The truth is not some vaguely racist mysticism. It's just business as usual. Greedy billionaires doing what they do best, making the world a worse place for everyone but themselves for the sake of limitless profit. The Clippers wouldn't do a whole lot better in San Diego. They would spend just 6 seasons there, failing to make the playoffs each year, being bottom 3 in attendance almost every year, and worst of all, after just 3 seasons and some buyer's remorse, Irv Levin would sell the franchise to Donald Sterling, a dirty clan hood that was magically turned into a real boy so that he could make billions off of exploiting people's need to, live somewhere. We will get into the depravity of this individual further down the road, but rest assured, said depravity affected this franchise every single year in some shape or form. Yet again, ownership changes hands, and the new guy in town wants to ship the team somewhere that's theoretically more profitable. Donald Sterling tried to make the move from San Diego to Los Angeles in 1982, but was denied by the league. I'm not really sure why they would do that, but just to speculate, maybe it's because they already had a storied, uber popular franchise in Los Angeles that just so happened to be in the midst of a dynasty. The league didn't think the Showtime Lakers needed an understudy. But Sterling would not take no for an answer, filing the move to Los Angeles again just a couple of years later in 1984, and after a second denial, he just moved them there anyways. I didn't know you could do that. This sparked a lawsuit from the league and a countersuit from Sterling, which he eventually won, meaning that there would now be 2 franchises in Los Angeles. Just like in San Diego, the Los Angeles Clippers sucked ass, and they would fail to make the playoffs altogether in the 1980s. This despite fielding some interesting talent. They would trade for Norm Nixon, Marquise Johnson, Doc Rivers, and Ron Harper, and they'd draft Danny Manning and Charles Smith. All of this culminated in their first playoff appearance as the Clippers in 1992, the first overall since they made it as the Buffalo Braves in 1976. Quite a drought. They would lose in round 1 to a pedo and an anti-vaxxer, and the following season, after swapping Doc Rivers for Mark Jackson, they'd make the playoffs again, this time taking their first round exit from the Rockets. But after that, we once again just got an objectively super weird season from the Clippers. Most of their core remained with the team, but they also added a 34-year-old Dominique Wilkins to the roster at the 1994 trade deadline. Wilkins proceeded to average nearly 30 points per game for the remaining 25 games of the year, but to pull off this deal, they had to send their 27-year-old all-star Danny Manning to Atlanta. They would fail to make the playoffs as the Clippers won just 8 of those 25 games with Dominique, and then he just left them in free agency for the Celtics anyways. So they traded a 27-year-old all-star for a 34-year-old who put up empty stats in 25 games before just walking away. What a franchise, man. This resulted in 3 more seasons without a postseason appearance. They somehow made it with 36 wins in 1997, getting swept by the pedo and anti-vaxxer again, and it would be another 8 seasons before they'd make it back to the playoffs. This time, thanks to Elton Brand, who the Clippers acquired from the Chicago Bulls, because Brand was really good in his first 2 seasons with the Bulls, and if there's one thing Chicago as a franchise just absolutely will not allow, it's talented players being on the roster long-term post-Michael Jordan. Brand would average 25 and 10 in 2006 alongside an older Sam Cassell and Corey Maggette, and the Clippers would actually make it past round 1 for the first time in their history as the Clippers, getting past Carmelo Anthony's Nuggets in 5 games before losing a 7-game series to Steve Nash's Suns without Amari Stoudemire. They fell just 1 game short of the conference finals, but don't you worry, I'm sure they'll be there in no time. Unfortunately, the following year, Sam Cassell and Elton Brand would see significant dips in their scoring averages, combining for 9 fewer points per game, resulting in 7 less wins and missing the playoffs yet again. In another stroke of bad luck, Elton Brand would rupture his Achilles in the offseason, managing to return for the final 8 games of the 2008 season with the Clippers before walking away in free agency to play for Philly. What followed was once again a prolonged period of being an awful team. To this point in their history, the Clippers have been pretty miserable. They've existed now 38 seasons and only made the playoffs 7 times. That's a really awful hit rate. Other than McAdoo in their Buffalo days, they haven't had a superstar. There's not really much of anybody worth remembering in this team's history. Whenever the Clippers were good enough to make the playoffs, they made it with forgettable teams that only spent a year or 2 together. But then something big happened. Probably the most important thing to happen in the history of this franchise. The Clippers got the first overall pick in a loaded 2009 draft.
With the first pick in the 2009 NBA draft, the Los Angeles Clippers select Blake Griffin.
Blake, coming out of college, was the consensus #1 overall pick in a historic draft class. Standing at 6'9" with a vertical that was off the charts, Blake Griffin put the power in power forward. I mean, look at these dunks, man. But Blake wasn't simply a run and dunk man. He was also a great ball handler, passer, a decent mid-range and eventually three-point shooter, and he had a pretty good, if unconventional, back-to-the-basket game. He could pull down the rim, but also orchestrate your offense, and after getting injured and missing what would have been his first year, Blake would have the best rookie season the NBA has seen since Tim Duncan. Like Duncan, making the All-Star game in the process, unlike Duncan, he also participated in the slam dunk contest and won the damn thing. You would have thought Tim Duncan would have played in the dunk contest given his name, but I guess not. Blake's rookie year was a real moment in the NBA. He quickly became one of the league's most marketable superstars, and suddenly the Clippers had more attention than ever.
Blake, do you believe you can do this? You gotta believe.
The Clippers also had some exciting young talent to pair with him. DeAndre Jordan, another high-flying big man. He was far less versatile overall, but in terms of punching it into the rim, DeAndre could hang with Blake.
The lob. A jam! Oh, what a monster jam by DeAndre Jordan!
And Eric Gordon was a 22-point-per-game scorer at the two-guard position alongside Blake this year. Despite Griffin's insane impact as a rookie, the Clips would only win 32 games this season. To make matters worse, in an effort to put talent around Blake quickly, they would trade their first-round pick for Mo Williams, and despite having a 2.8% chance, the pick went #1, and Kyrie Irving went to the Cavs instead of LA. The Clippers' curse never sleeps. But in the 2011 offseason, the Clippers would make it all the better with a move that would bring it all together.
Such a cliche, but for the Hornets, the third time was a charm. After 2 failed attempts to trade superstar Chris Paul to LA, the Hornets finally succeeded. So one of the greatest athletes to ever represent New Orleans is officially a member of the Los Angeles Clippers.
Yeah, this was a massive moment for this franchise. For 2 reasons, really. Number 1, it's fucking Chris Paul. Forget all that lame shit you see 12-year-olds on Twitter saying about CP3. If you were there, you know how lethal the guy was. Chris is one of the greatest guards in league history. I personally believe he is the greatest pound-for-pound player ever, as the dude is barely 6 foot tall. No offense to Allen Iverson. But number 2, and honestly more important in the spiritual sense, in terms of what feels good in your soul, they actually got one over on the Lakers. Or at least benefited heavily from David Stern bending over the Lakers, which allowed the Clippers to swoop in and make Chris Paul the savior of the LA Clippers, not the Lakers. I know that had to feel good. Little brother gets the toy this time. The Lakers were on their way towards a dark period in their franchise, as their recent championship core was starting to age. Meanwhile, for the Clippers, well, LA is their city now. In fact, it's Lob City now.
Again. The lob. The jam. Are you kidding me? Oh, crosses over, drives and scores. Ball again against Iguodala. There it is for the lead. Look out.
Chris Paul's elite playmaking combined with Blake Griffin and DeAndre Jordan's athleticism unlocked a go-to move that was nearly unguardable. Alley-oops. The lob in Lob City isn't just a flashy play, it's super effective. The scoring gravity of the lob creates vertical spacing, and the Clippers' futuristic proficiency in this classic instant highlight puts defenses into impossible positions. Not that lobs weren't prominent in the NBA before the Lob City Clippers, but they definitely feel way more prominent now. Chris Paul's combination of scoring gravity and devastatingly effective playmaking meant picking your poison out of the pick and roll. Either allow a Paul midi or a lob. Say that 10 times fast, picking your poison out of a pick and roll. This is a bad position to be in as a defender because either way you're giving up a clean look. Chris Paul is going to make the right read every time. Lobs are flashy and fun, absolutely, but the lob also won the Clippers plenty of games. With either big screening for Paul and solid to great shooters on the wing, a good shot was almost always the outcome. The rest of the roster beyond those three was not all that good out of the gate, which meant it took a year or two for them to be true contenders. In their first season, the Lob City Clippers made a respectable playoff run, actually defeating the grit and grind Memphis Grizzlies in a low-scoring Game 7 on the road before being swept by a much more seasoned Spurs team featuring a rookie Kawhi Leonard. The 2012 offseason brought Jamal Crawford and Matt Barnes to the team. Matt was a 3-and-D wing, and Jamal, well, he could do stuff like this.
Crawford at distance. Oh, what a beautiful move to free himself.
On their next playoff run, even though the roster was better and they had home court advantage this time, they ended up letting the Memphis Grizzlies get revenge, losing in 6 games in round 1, with both Jamal Crawford and Blake Griffin underperforming. The 2013 offseason saw the addition of JJ Redick, a sharpshooter who elevated the Lob City offense to another level by giving CP3 an elite three-point shooter to kick out to. The Clippers shot just 30% from 3 in that Memphis series loss, so having a sniper like JJ to rely on added a whole new dynamic to the team. This wasn't their only improvement though, as Blake Griffin took a superstar leap, going from a then career low 18 points per game to a then career high 24.1 and coming third in the MVP race. While DeAndre Jordan led the league in rebounding and became a Defensive Player of the Year candidate, and Chris Paul had a classic Chris Paul season by leading the NBA in steals and assists again, his first time in LA. The Clippers went from 4th in offense to number 1 and entered their prime as legitimate true contenders. In the 2014 playoffs, they survived a tough 7-game series against the up-and-coming Golden State Warriors in round 1. Even though the Clippers had to overcome a monstrous distraction. They found themselves in the national spotlight for non-basketball related reasons following winning a tight Game 3 98-96 on April 24th, because April 25th was when the world learned just who Donald Sterling really was.
Accused of making racist remarks caught on tape, players and fans are increasing the pressure.
His reported girlfriend, V. Stiviano, so often seen with him courtside,
we talk to you for just a quick second?
Today dodging swarms of reporters.
I'm Mr. Sterling's right-hand arm man. I'm Mr. Sterling everything. I'm his confidant, his best friend, his silly rabbit.
His what?
His silly rabbit.
His silly rabbit?
Yes.
Is that what he calls you?
No.
It's one of their alleged conversations that's at the center of this firestorm. A recording of a racist rant, apparently by the Clippers owner.
Yeah, it bothers me a lot that you want to broadcast that you're associating with black people. You have to.
The recording was obtained by TMZ and Deadspin and is believed to have stemmed from this picture showing Stiviano with basketball legend Magic Johnson. She posted it on Instagram.
Don't come to my games. Don't bring black people and don't come.
Do you know that you have a whole team that's black that plays for you?
Do I know? I support them and give them food and clothes and cars and houses.
The team considered boycotting Game 4 before instead electing to wear their shirts inside out to obscure the Clippers' branding.
He's got to give up the team. If he doesn't like African Americans and you're in a league that's over 70% African American.
And I think that we just have to be clear and steady in denouncing it, teaching our children differently.
V. Stiviano's attorney said the tape is real, but denies that she released it. Stiviano is being sued by Sterling's wife, Rochelle, for embezzling millions, including a $1.8 million apartment and luxury cars. Stiviano insists they were gifts. Today, in a conference call with reporters, the Clippers' own coach, Doc Rivers, said he thinks Sterling made the racist comments.
Yeah, I believe he said those things. I can't tell you how upset I am, our players are.
In round 2, this happened.
Ball had it knocked away by Westbrook. The steal leads to this. Jackson is fouled by Barnes. And out of bounds. Down by 2, Westbrook for the... And he was fouled on the 3. Down to 3, down to 2. Trying to get it down low, and Ibaka took it away.
Yeah, the idea that Paul is some historic playoff choker is wildly overblown, but if one were to make that point, this is probably the first example cited. But the Clippers blowing it in the playoffs ultimately felt insignificant in the wake of the Sterling scandal. This was coincidentally right as Adam Silver was taking over as the NBA's commissioner as well, so he had to make a statement by acting swiftly.
I'm not as sure about what they ought to announce as what they should announce. I suspect there'll be an indefinite suspension. You cannot have Donald Sterling sitting in his usual courtside seat on the floor, absorbing all that television attention during an NBA game. The league can't want that, and his television partners cannot want that. But I think there's something beyond that, and they'll do that until they can try to figure out a way to transfer ownership to someone else. Not transfer, but allow them to sell the team.
But Mike, they can't force him to sell. So how does this happen? And what the fine can only be $1 million maximum?
We're talking about a group of billionaire owners, most of those other 29 that will assemble or reach each other by conference call. We're talking about some of the richest and most influential people in the country in other business areas. And certainly when they put their minds together, they can decide if they don't want this person being their partner anymore.
Effective immediately, I am banning Mr. Sterling for life from any association with the Clippers organization or the NBA.
There was plenty of time for the National Basketball Association, considering the reporting that was done, to have reacted and put him on a short leash or have a zero tolerance policy years ago. How it got to this point is really pretty mysterious.
Sterling has been accused of racism before. He was by the Justice Department for refusing to rent apartments in his real estate developments to minorities.
Unfortunately, with the way this country works, there wasn't much the NBA could do about this in terms of genuinely significant punishment. All they could do was force Sterling to sell the team and give him a hefty fine, but he was also going to be able to charge full price when he sells it. Oh no, billions more dollars in wealth. What a brutal sentence. It's almost like the system is built around letting guys like this weasel their way out of everything. Usually better for it on the other side. At least now he's a household name exclusively because he's such a shithead. This moment in time was not only a distraction then, but Sterling's conduct was bad throughout his entire tenure as owner. He only cared about profits and operated as such, and beyond this incident, there have been a handful of horror stories to come out about Donald's misconduct. He was sued twice for sexual harassment, both instances being with Clippers employees, and outside of the Clippers, he has also been sued for housing discrimination, allegedly saying a bunch of shit even more racist than in that recording. He countersued the NBA for $1 billion, but then he got Alzheimer's and was deemed lacking in the medical capacity to be a trustee. Womp womp. Ex-Microsoft CEO Steve Ballmer paid $2 billion for the Clippers on August 12, 2014, about 109 days after TMZ introduced the world to Sterling. And he definitely brought an energy and enthusiasm that was lacking with the previous evil overlord.
The key to industry transformation, the key to success is developers, 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 developers. Developers, 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 developers. Yes!
Don't get me wrong, pretty much every billionaire is evil at the end of the day. But at the very least, in terms of how he was operating as a owner, it's a big upgrade from the likes of Sterling and John Y. Brown Jr. On the court, the 2014-15 season saw the Clippers repeat their recent regular season success, but their defense slipped outside of the top 10. They faced Kawhi Leonard and the now defending champion Spurs in an incredible first-round series where everyone on the Clippers was on their A game. Besides for one guy. None of the games were all too close until Game 7, which came down to the wire. After a pair of free throws from Duncan, the score was tied at 109 with 9 seconds remaining. I don't think Chris Paul gets enough credit for hitting a Game 7 game winner, especially given his reputation as a playoff choker. Round 2 was against the runner-up for MVP James Harden and the Houston Rockets. LA started strong, taking a 3-1 lead despite DeAndre Jordan taking 34 free throws from Houston hacking him in Game 4, and winning by an average of over 24 points in those 3 Ws. But then, the curse struck again. Now, throughout Clippers history to this point, we've seen some playoff blunders a little, but for the most part, a lot of the bad luck of this franchise has been injury-related. Game 5, you could blame it on the bench. Chris and Blake scored 52 points combined on 21 of 37 shooting. The rest of the team scored 51 points on 17 of 54 shooting. But if there is any one game that indicates that this franchise is cursed, Game 6 versus Houston is that game. Because it wasn't any of the Rockets' best players that swung the series, it was Josh Smith and Corey Brewer, 2 career bad three-point shooters having career great three-point shooting nights.
Houston misses the 3. Redick makes the margins 12. The save by Jordan took out 2 people. Smith thought about launching. He'll hold on. 9-point game. Now Smith will take the 3 and hit. And it's down to 6. Josh Smith for back-to-back. Triples. Incredible. All even at 102. Houston for the lead. It is Brewer for 3. And he hit it. Smith's got Jordan. Steps back, takes it, and makes it.
If anything is proof of a curse, that's it. For those closing 3 games, Paul and Griffin, on average, scored 54.6 points per game on 65 of 119 shooting overall, which is 54%, while everybody else averaged 48.6 points on 52 of 155 shooting, which is 33% shooting. Despite the collapse, the Clippers didn't make significant changes. They gave signing Josh Smith a try, brought on an aging Paul Pierce, but ultimately failed to contend again. 2 more disappointing years of injury-riddled first-round exits come and go, and Chris Paul breaks up the band by asking for a trade to be sent to the Houston Rockets on June 29, 2017. 2017 was also the year that team owner Steve Ballmer reached an agreement with the city of Inglewood to bring the Clippers to their own stadium. So rather than tear down the current roster and rebuild, he opted to re-sign their franchise player Blake Griffin to a max deal on July 18th, promising that he would be a Clipper for life, only to trade him to Detroit later that same season for Tobias Harris on January 29, 2018. Griffin ended up playing his best basketball in Detroit before injuries derailed his career, while Ballmer's Clippers looked towards a new era. What was really weird about how LA went about this new era was the way they didn't invest in young players almost at all. The CP3 and Griffin trades, plus Ballmer's willingness to spend in free agency, brought in a ton of established role players like Patrick Beverley, Montrezl Harrell, Avery Bradley, Lou Williams, Tobias Harris, and Danilo Gallinari. They remained competitive, narrowly missing the playoffs at first with a 42-40 record. They also drafted Shai Gilgeous-Alexander in 2018 and proceeded to win 48 games in the 2018-19 season, good enough for the 8th seed, and they would even push the number 1 seed Warriors to 6 games in round 1, but there was just no way this team could overcome Steph Curry and Kevin Durant. But behind the scenes, bigger things were happening. See, 2019 wasn't just when these ragtag Clippers stole 2 wins from a super team in the first round. This was also when Kawhi Leonard was post-beef with San Antonio, and it had been reported that he wanted to play for either LA team before being shipped to Toronto and winning a championship.
So I guess this is real. What does it feel like knowing, okay, y'all are Clippers now, together here?
It feels great. I think seeing that kind of solidified it, opened that chapter of this new journey that we're going on. Still kind of surreal.
All right, let's do this one last time. What team is Kawhi joining here? Let's start with his co-star Paul George. PG has had an interesting career to this point. He's spent his career not only being one of the best perimeter defenders in the NBA and low-key one of the best three-point shooters ever, but he also had the athleticism to devastate opponents at the rim. Within just a few years of being drafted by the Indiana Pacers in 2010, Paul rose to superstardom, winning Most Improved Player in 2013 and presenting the only real obstacle to the Big Three Miami Heat in the East, forcing them to a Game 7, while George was doing stuff like this.
Here comes George, got the step and stuffs one move and counts in the foul.
We are seeing a superstar in the making here with Paul George.
Unfortunately, the Pacers roster eventually started to lose a lot of the chemistry that made them so good, and the landscape of the NBA evolved faster than the team did. In the summer of 2014, Lance Stevenson left Indiana to sign with Charlotte in a hilariously failed effort to be a star in his own right. And then just a couple of weeks later, Paul's leg got caught on the stanchion during a Team USA scrimmage in Las Vegas, and his leg went the opposite way that you'd want it to. He missed a bunch of time, key pieces of the roster dropped like flies, and George eventually asked out and was sent to OKC to play alongside the reigning MVP and triple-double machine Russell Westbrook in exchange for an electric guard in Victor Oladipo and budding future star big Domantas Sabonis. PG's first season with OKC in 2017-18 was somewhat of a dud due to the third head of their big three, Carmelo Anthony, and his awkward fit in this team's dynamic. The chemistry was off, and a blossoming Jeremy Grant made way more sense as the other forward in the starting lineup. These Thunder would only win one more game than the previous season, but year two did go a lot better, specifically for Paul George, who arguably had his best season, finishing third in MVP and DPOY voting in 2019. Unfortunately, he was pretty hobbled going into their round one matchup against the Blazers, which resulted in his last possession in a Thunder jersey ending like this.
To send the Thunder home. Lillard, long-range three, and it's good! At the buzzer!
At some point, you got to let a guy shoot that, don't you, and just live with the results?
Yeah. I mean, that's a bad shot. Care what anybody says, that's a bad shot. But, hey, he made it. That story won't be told that it was a bad shot. We live with that.
Following this disappointment, PG saw the opportunity to go home to Los Angeles and play with the guy who had just led a team to an utterly unlikely championship, and he didn't hesitate to go for it. With the Clippers under relatively new ownership in Steve Ballmer and the Lob City era coming to a definitive, albeit weird close, the team was looking to swing for the fences and make a big move to take on a new winning identity. He coordinated with Kawhi, made it to where the LA Clippers would need to trade for Paul George in order to sign Kawhi as a free agent, or else risk Kawhi signing with the other LA team. And incidentally, he set up the OKC Thunder in the process to dominate in the near future, because that Shai Gilgeous-Alexander guy turned out to be pretty good, even better than Paul George has ever been, but I'm getting ahead of myself. The Thunder get a Godfather deal for PG, basically collecting enough assets throughout this trade to make it seem like they got paid the full price for both George and Leonard, and this makes the deal eligible for being considered one of the most one-sided trades of all time. It seemed worth it though, as despite George and Kawhi playing the same position, they also play the most flexible position in the sport and had pretty significant differences in play style. George was primarily a three-point shooter with a bit more ball handling and playmaking chops. He really liked to get into his bag, as the kids say, while Kawhi was a mid-range assassin who could operate on just a few simple moves. They could both play the 2 through 4, both were effective with and without the ball, and when you consider the defensive potential between the two, the pairing makes sense. On paper, anyways. I would argue that Kawhi was better off paired with a playmaking point guard as his best teammate, or perhaps as he displayed in 2016 when he led the Spurs to 67 wins, he was better off paired with a scoring power forward. Man, Imagine if he could have had both of those. As for the rest of the roster, Lou Williams is a sixth man that was actually good. Same goes for Montrezl Harrell, who broke out in the years between Lob City and Kawhi's era. In fact, both would compete for Sixth Man of the Year this season, with Harrell eventually winning it. Those two as an offensive duo brought a lot of punch to the bench. The actual starting point and five-man were Patrick Beverley and Ivica Zubac. Beverley is your classic 3-and-D guy with a dash of recklessness on the court and Zionist tendencies off of it. Zubac was basically stolen from the Lakers in a trade the season prior, becoming the quintessential prototype for a traditional big. They also traded for Marcus Morris, who was a 20-point scorer on the Knicks. A bit of empty stat syndrome, but hey, the guy could score a relatively efficient 10 to 13 a night. Sure, it meant giving ISO possessions to like your fifth best scorer, but at least this was a good roster, no doubt, with many understandably calling the Clippers a super team when it all came together. But in hindsight, this roster was riddled with flaws. First of all, you have little offense outside of your two stars in the starting lineup. There is also a high propensity for tough shot taking with this squad. Kawhi, PG, Lou Will, and kind of Marcus Morris are your only real shot creators, and they all love tough jumpers. And oftentimes, LA's offense would stagnate because they had an extremely volatile shot diet. I also really don't like the center rotation. Zubac was fine, maybe even above average, but Harrell ultimately played way more, nearly 10 more minutes per game than Zoo, who was a meaningfully better defender, despite the fact that Harrell was basically a zero or even a negative on the defensive end, not to mention his own limitations within the offense. If it wasn't a pick and roll or offensive rebound, there wasn't much that Trez could bring to the table. But their saving grace on D was their aptitude outside of the paint. The Clippers' perimeter defense was truly great, and it enabled them to be the fifth best defense in the NBA in the 2020 regular season, but in the playoffs, not having any reliable rim protection would kill them. Of the 8 teams that advanced in the second round in the 2020 playoffs, the Clippers were 6th in defensive rating. But their paint defense was not their weakest link. To me, this team's biggest issue was the Doc Rivers of it all. A lot of problems I just mentioned could be mitigated by a better coach at the helm. A good coach can hide weaknesses well enough to allow the team's strength to prevail. Now, how did Doc do in this role? To be honest, other than using Marcus Morris as a 5 in the playoffs against the Mavericks, I can't think of a single remotely creative decision this guy made with this roster. Like, in totality, the more I look at Doc's resume, the more 2008 seems like it happened in spite of him. But there was one final factor that helped kill the Clippers this year.
The NBA has made the decision. They have just announced that they are suspending play, finishing after tonight's games. They're going to let tonight's games finish. But starting tomorrow, NBA play is suspended, and then the league is going to use that hiatus to decide their next steps, how they'll go forward. But this is the last night of NBA games for the foreseeable future.
Before Rudy Gobert became patient zero of a global pandemic, LA was rolling through the season on their way towards legitimately contending for an NBA title. But the shutdown affected a lot of teams in a lot of different ways, and for the Clippers, being in the bubble affected Paul George's mental health. I know a lot of people think he just has no right to feel that way because he has money and success, but even if that worldview wasn't shitty and unproductive, it wouldn't change the fact that the guy was depressed, and that affected the result. Personally, I don't have the most rigorous schedule, and depression can still be crippling to me. I can't imagine having to put on a brave face for the schedule of an NBA player, especially one that limits the lifestyle aspect to being isolated in a hotel room, only allowed to leave for the occasional scheduled leisure time on site and a basketball game here or there. Montrezl Harrell also experienced a death in the family, and that affected him and his performance. But with all that said, Every team has stories like this to some degree or another. Hell, the eventual champion Lakers lost their starting shooting guard due to the bubble. Great teams persevere. Unfortunately, however, great isn't quite the word that I would use to describe this team.
Smith to inbound. Back to Doncic. Doncic pulls up, three-pointer. Bang! Bang! It's good! Doncic wins the game at the buzzer!
In round one, the Clippers flew all of their red flags by allowing their matchup with Dallas to go to 6 games. Luka Doncic made Kawhi and PG look completely unthreatening as a perimeter defensive duo. He would also attack switches on either of LA's centers, which resulted in Marcus Morris playing a ton of 5, as I mentioned earlier. It got so bad that they forgoed having a rim protector just to have more bodies to chase Luka around. And this is year 2 Luka, mind you. This is right before he experienced the twink death that took his dad's skitball game to the next level. Luka's second fiddle, Kristaps Porzingis, also had a good series, but otherwise this roster was not nearly good enough to hang with LA like they did. But it's fine. Inexperience ultimately decided this series, and in the next round, you have another inexperienced team. So this should be smooth sailing to the conference finals Battle of LA. Right. That's how things were looking at first. After 4 games, the Clippers had a 3-1 lead. That should be a wrap, folks. No one could mess up a lead like this. This isn't like something the same head coach did and was somehow not fired for like 5 seasons ago. The assessment that the Nuggets were inexperienced is mostly true, but they were freshly experienced in one thing: making a 3-1 lead comeback. The series just before this, the Jazz took a 3-1 lead, and then Jokic and Murray closed the series in the last 3 games, averaging a combined 64 points a night. They kicked ass with their backs against the wall, and that gave them the confidence they needed so that in round 2, when they looked over their shoulder and they saw a wall again, they smiled and locked in.
Out to Jokic. 2 on the shot clock. Hoist an off-balance jumper. Oh! It finds net! Murray, long three-pointer. It's good. Nuggets trying to extend this to a game 7. Jokic forces Murray one up. Trying to get it. Shot clock winding down. Murray puts up a 3. Bang!
LA allowed 108.6 points per game for the remaining 3 after allowing just 97.5 points per game in the first 4 games. And offensively, they put up a measly 89 points in Game 7. In that game, Kawhi and PG shot a combined 10 for 38. Jesus H. Christ.
They've gotten a number of second shots, though.
George, way off, hits the side of the backboard.
I went back and rewatched this Game 7, and I remembered my take at the time being about effort. And I thought maybe that was a lazy take from the past. Effort is often scapegoated because you can't think of a more complicated technical reason why something is wrong with a team. But no, 2020 me was spot on. This team lacked effort to the fullest degree. It looked like they didn't believe in the cause. It looked like they didn't like each other. You don't have to be friends to win championships, but it usually helps. Lou Will, years later, said the Clippers just didn't care, which a lot of people called bullshit on, but honestly, I believe him. Really, he probably shouldn't have been as honest as I think he is being.
It was a struggle to get us to the bubble to begin with. We didn't even want to go, you know, so I think just mentally we came into it without just the right mindset to finish the job.
Effort killed them. Roster construction issues killed them. Doc Rivers killed them. PG playing depressed killed them. But you know, I'm not just gonna let this slide, man. Yeah, I'm looking at you, Kawhi. You're the subject of this video. He himself was arguably the biggest perpetuator in the nonchalant attitude. Yes, Kawhi is a reserved guy, but you never got the impression that he didn't care in his Toronto run. But here, he played like a lifeless husk.
Oh, look at this. That's gutsy by Marcus Morris. Look at Kawhi. Is he going to smile?
No!
In 2 of LA's losses in round 2, Kawhi had 13 points on 4 of 17 shooting and 14 points on 6 of 22 shooting. That's going to kill you even without the bad body language. The guys in Toronto rallied behind Kawhi, but now everybody on this team feels like his coworker. Maybe the energy was killed for them by the bubble, maybe their mindset was their biggest obstacle, but one positive did come out of all of this. Doc Rivers resigned as head coach. I just imagine like shitty confetti effect and then like, celebrate good times, come on. And with some retooling to the roster, there was still ample opportunity ahead for the Clippers. To make things even better, their new head coach, Tyronn Lue, is legit one of the best in the business, having won the title with LeBron and the Cavs in 2016. They added some more depth on the wings, but failed to really address the 5 issue. They just opted to start Zubac, and he did a fine enough job. Lou Williams had his role reduced, which was for the better. Kawhi and PG both missed around 20 games, but they were available for the postseason. So here comes round 1, yet again versus the Mavs, and this time, LA's even a bit better than last year. But Luka just kept stringing the Clippers along. Luka averaged video game numbers for the entire 2021 series. This time, he got way less help from Porzingis. Luka was just on another level, so it didn't matter. But Kawhi Leonard also played like a demigod. These two matching up was the highlight of round 1 this year. I remember it very fondly. Reggie Jackson even emerged as the lead scoring guard after an injury to Lou Williams. It wasn't a great sign for LA that this went to 7, but honestly, Luka was really on something else. The Clippers ended up winning Game 7, 126-111. In the first 2 games of round 2, it looked like LA would somehow miss the conference finals yet again after going down 0-2 to the Utah Jazz thanks to a scorching start from Donovan Mitchell. But Kawhi and PG combined for 65 in Game 3 and 62 in Game 4. Unfortunately, however, Kawhi would get hurt and he would be out indefinitely. The Clippers' curse never sleeps. To his credit, Paul George managed to get the Clippers 2 more wins and advance them to the Western Conference Finals, which has evaded them for now 50 years.
It has been 50 years, Paul. 50 years this franchise has been waiting to get to a conference finals. What does it feel like to finally cross into that land for you?
Man, it feels great. They rid us off when Kawhi went down. Everybody had to step up. We knew we had to step up in this loss.
We're going to call this the Terrence Mann game. Terrence, did you know you had this in you tonight?
Yeah, I mean, I just trust my work.
Did you know he had this in him tonight?
Yes.
This series versus Utah was probably his best as a Clipper, and one of his best period. He averaged 32, 9, and 5 in the closing 4 games. That said, they could not hang with the CP3 Devin Booker Suns, even if, again, they did put up a respectable fight. But hey, at least Chris Paul got his revenge on the Clips, I guess. But don't worry, the news gets worse. Kawhi's injury was actually severe, so severe that he is going to be out for the entirety of the next season. But because they lost their first-round picks in the Paul George trade, they couldn't just tank the season to get valuable draft capital. Instead, they had to have a nothing season that got them 42 wins and no playoff appearance. Just for the record, that first-round pick was used to draft Jalen Williams. And sorry, Clippers fans, it is unfortunately the Jalen Williams that's really good. It's okay though. Kawhi is back for the 2022-23 season. Lou Williams is gone, but now the scoring punch comes from the guard tandem of Eric Gordon, again, and Norman Powell, which is, fine, I guess. They even finally get a high-level playmaker for the first time in this era, which is something that had gone unaddressed for far too long. Unfortunately, it came late in the season, and with a player who otherwise had a difficult fit in Russell Westbrook. Russ had fallen from his MVP stature in recent seasons, going from team to team with mixed success, with the low point of his career being earlier that season playing alongside Bron and AD for the other LA team. He looked much better in this LA uniform, but it wouldn't really matter because Paul George got hurt right before the 2023 playoffs, and Kawhi can apparently only manage to appear in just 2 games, so they lose to the Suns in 5 games in round 1 despite Russell Westbrook averaging 23 points per game for the series. The Clippers followed that letdown with their first real big splash acquisition since the Kawhi era began, trading for James Harden early into the season on October 31st, 2023. Harden was leaving a team with bad blood for the upteenth time, which to this point everyone was sick of, so the Clippers got him for pennies on the dollar. Now, I would love to have been excited about this roster, but I was skeptical it would all actually come together. And as the story seems to always go for the Clippers, when the trio of Paul George, Kawhi, and Harden all played together, the team looked good. The team actually won 50 games for the first time post-Lob City. Health even permitted the 3 of them to play together quite a bit, but that old reliable curse caught up with them towards the end of the season, as we didn't get to see them together for most of their 2024 playoff run, getting only 2 games out of Kawhi in a 6-game series loss to Luka again in round 1. He was injured and visibly a worse player for it. He sat out game 1, came into game 2 and 3 to try and do his Kawhi thing, and then sat out for the remainder of the series. The Clippers were doomed from the start. Then Paul George just leaves in the offseason. Like it was actually a good old let him walk from LA, because he saw the ship is sinking and understandably wanted off. Not to mention this ship didn't seem all that invested in him anyways, and now here we are today. Is there a reality out there where Kawhi is magically healthy again and he takes the Clippers all the way to the title with Harden as his sidekick? I mean, sure, maybe. Why not? But more likely than not, the Kawhi era is going to be remembered as a failure. And considering the potential this team had to finally break the Clippers curse, it just makes me sad, honestly. There was a lot of mismanagement that got us to where we are today, but it's hard not to feel like in some way this was inevitable. It's the fucking Clippers. Recently, a lot of discussion has been had about whether or not LA should have gone down this road to begin with. Was it really all that wise to go in with this star forward duo to the degree that they did? I think in many ways, the PG trade started the era of overpaying for superstars. Trades for the biggest names in the NBA have only gotten larger in scale and more dramatic in their consequence. It's weird that such a Hail Mary that ultimately fell short overall influenced the NBA's culture around trades so much. I don't think deals like KD to Phoenix look like they do without this trade. Hell, look at what the Pacers got for a younger Paul George just 2 years prior. The difference is night and day. Superstars used to get traded for what feels like virtually nothing. Nowadays, there are major long-term consequences to these deals, and LA is now the poster boy of it, as unfortunately this deal was foundational in building the team that is my personal pick for the title favorite this year. SGA is possibly going to walk away with MVP this year. J-Dub, who was drafted with the pick from the Paul George deal, is going to be an all-star. The Thunder might win 70 games, and they still have 2 firsts from LA that have yet to have conveyed. The Clippers are built around 2 aging and increasingly injury-prone stars, a couple of high-quality role players who could net you a pick or 2 in a deal, but otherwise they have no real assets. No real future. Things are fucking bleak. So, should LA regret the PG trade, a deal they did explicitly to secure Kawhi Leonard? Well, yes and no. With the power of hindsight, yeah, if the Clippers could do it all over again, maybe they would. But you can't judge this on hindsight. When all of this went down in the summer of 2019, everyone's collective reaction was, wow, that's a lot of assets, but yes, it's worth it because PG and Kawhi are coming off of their best seasons. Kawhi was rightfully in best in the world conversations, and considering they didn't have that much direction otherwise, making this deal is a no-brainer. Any GM across sports history would do this if presented with the same circumstances. Yes, as a Clippers fan, it would make sense to be a little bitter watching SGA hoist up that trophy. But if it helps you stomach it any better, so long as Kawhi was dead set on going to LA, which he clearly was, you were never keeping SGA. This is always how it was going to go down. The only what-if scenario here is what if the people involved in this were fundamentally different people in fundamentally different circumstances? And I gotta tell you, that sounds like a really shitty what-if. The real what-if I walk away from is wondering, what if the world wasn't organized in a way where the emotional whims and greed of billionaires have major negative consequences for everybody but themselves? What if the Buffalo Braves moved to Cincinnati? What if Donald Sterling wasn't a landlord? What if Steve Ballmer never cried at those developers?
Yes!
What if the Spurs doctors listened to Kawhi? What if he stayed on the Raptors? What if we could go back in time and somehow fix all of this? We may never know about our imaginary pasts, but we can always imagine a better future. A better world is possible. Curses aren't real. Kawhi Leonard has had one of the most outlier careers of all time in so many ways. From him basically coming as close as anyone to MJ for a brief couple of years, to the drama with Spurs management, challenging a franchise with 20 years of championship success to back them up, to his load management-filled Clippers nightmare. I can't even come close to thinking of a career arc that is similar to it. People say like Bill Walton and shit, but that does not really hold up when you do a direct comparison. What's odd is I don't think this uniqueness is often highlighted thanks to how minimal we see the Kawhi from behind the scenes. But the guy's career is straight up a soap opera. He just keeps a straight face during all of the overly dramatic scenes, so if it doesn't seem like that big of a deal to him, it doesn't feel like that big of a deal to us. He doesn't play the narrative game. And yet, he's been swept up in so many of them. It's hard to even quantify what exactly his career will be remembered for or remembered as. For some, he may be remembered for being perhaps the greatest defensive wing ever at his peak, for his mid-range assassin offense, for his most iconic shot, or for his load management, failures in the playoffs post-2019, and worst of all, will he just be remembered more for the what-if of his career rather than what he actually did accomplish? For me, I see it like this. Kawhi still has a stacked resume and a career full of big-time moments despite a start and end-ish to his career that wasn't exactly ideal. The 2019 title run is one that will never be forgotten by a whole goddamn country, so he has enough wind in his sails to be in the pantheon of all-time greats. Undoubtedly a Hall of Famer, and to me, undoubtedly a top 50 player of all time. Now, when that 2019 run went down, I actually considered Kawhi 20th of all time fresh off of that. I think it's fair to say I was drinking the Kool-Aid a little bit there, and I certainly wouldn't place him that high in hindsight. But his peak was great enough that by no means do I think it's like an outright silly take. Recency bias riddled, absolutely. But at the time, I'd never witnessed live a Michael Jordan-esque run. In terms of the numbers, the impact, and the eye test, Kawhi had a playoff run comparable to the guy who most consider the GOAT at his best. He was the GOAT for 1 year, and I hope we continue to celebrate that year for what it is, as I think we did that pretty well in this video, but there's going to need to be a constant rehash over the years to maintain this run being in the public consciousness. If not, I fear history will remember Kawhi mostly as a what if, the GOAT that never really had a chance to show it, the GOAT that never was. But as we've proved throughout this long-ass video documenting his ups and downs over the years, Kawhi still has plenty to enjoy in his story, and he isn't necessarily done growing that story. I'm still holding out some hope. Thank you so much for watching, especially if you made it to this point in the video. Holy shit, this thing's like damn near 3 hours, so that seriously is a huge time investment, and I appreciate it. I'm sure it was background noise while you were doing other work, but I can't blame you. That's the same shit I do. Seriously, appreciate it a lot. If you could be so kind, I'd appreciate it if you dropped a like on the video. And if you would like to support us further than that, go ahead and check us out over on Patreon. You get extra content early over there, and you get access to a Discord with other subs of this channel, like-minded people who just like a good basketball conversation without being belligerent about that. But if you just want to leave your support at watching the video, I still appreciate you nonetheless. Let us know what you think of the supercut. This is something that we're experimenting with doing because we've seen it work for other channels, but we also don't want to just turn this thing into a content farm. So you guys let us know how you feel about it, maybe some things we can change. Or if you just outright hated the thing, also let us know that. Seriously, we want your unfiltered thoughts. I had some skepticism at least about doing this, but I think it's good. I think it still works out to be good content. I don't know. You guys let us know. But that is it. I'll see you guys next time.